There is a river in the dark and it is full of ice. This is broken ice, slabs and plates and wheels of it, some the size of a barn door. It is the 25th of December, 1776. The morning had been almost pleasant, in the way a knife can be almost warm. By afternoon, the clouds thickened and the air crawled up into the upper 20s, and any farmer along the Delaware reading that sky over the top of a fence rail would have gone and brought his stock in early. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the nor'easter arrives, and it arrives all at once. Rain first, then hail, then sleet, then snow, driving sideways across open water into the faces of men who were already wet to the thigh. The crossing had begun around 5 o'clock at McConkey's Ferry, hours behind schedule, and it will run hours later still. The big cargo boats are Durham boats, long black shallow things built to haul pig iron down the river to Philadelphia, and never once in their working lives intended to carry artillery, horses and freezing infantry through a current choked with ice at night. Working them are Colonel John Glover's men, the 14th Continental Regiment, fishermen and sailors out of Marblehead, Massachusetts, who spend that entire night standing on wet wood in the dark, setting their poles against the bottom of the Delaware, walking the boats forward foot by foot, hauling the poles up and doing it again, and again, and again. They do not lose a man, or a horse, or a gun. That detail alone ought to be far more famous than it is. The countersign that night, the word you give a sentry so that he does not shoot you, is victory or death. Somebody chose that phrase on purpose, and every man who murmurs it into the sleet understands exactly what arithmetic sits behind it. Historians still argue whether Washington truly had Thomas Paine's new pamphlet read aloud to the men before the boats went out. It had been printed at Philadelphia on the 19th of December, 6 days earlier, and it began, "These are the times that try men's souls." Whether or not anyone read it to them that night, the men in those boats were living the sentence. On the far bank, the column forms up and begins a 9-mile march to Trenton, on roads that are half mud and half ice, in a storm that is now fully committed to itself. 2 men on that road lie down and do not get up again. They freeze to death on the way, and their names come down to us thinly, the way such names usually do. 2 other columns, under Cadwallader and Ewing, try to get across further downriver and simply cannot. The ice beats them. But this is not their story tonight. Or, not only theirs. Because a few miles back from that road, behind the hedgerows and the stubble and the black bones of the orchards, there are houses, low ones, with smoke standing up out of the chimney in a thin grey rope. Nobody in them is making history. Nobody in them will be painted standing heroically in a boat. They are simply trying to get from one October to the next October, with the same number of people they started with, which in that century was a considerably harder trick than it sounds. Tonight you are one of them. Tonight you are the family in the farmhouse, a few fields off the Trenton Road, and the whole long winter is ahead of you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what the clock says where you are right now. I love reading those. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that somebody is hearing this over a rainy afternoon in one hemisphere, while somebody else is halfway to sleep at 2 in the morning in another, and that for a little while tonight, all of us are wintering in New Jersey together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So let the river go. Let the boats and the poles and the sleet drift off downstream, because we are going to rewind a little. Back a few weeks, back to autumn, back to the last part of the year when the world was still kind. Settle your shoulders down away from your ears. Let your jaw come unhooked. Feel the weight of your legs and let the bed take them. You have no more use for them tonight. You are in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. It is the autumn of 1776. Your house sits on a rise above a creek that runs fast in March and shows its stones in August, and it faces south because your grandfather was not a romantic man and wanted the sun on the front of the building in January. The house is timber framed, great squared oak posts and beams cut from your own woodlot, joined with mortise and tenon and pegged. No nails to speak of, because nails cost money and trees do not. The frame was raised in a single day with every neighbour within 4 miles standing under it, and afterward there was cider, and somebody's cousin fell off the summer beam and was fine. Outside it is clapboard, weathered to the colour of a mourning dove. Inside the floorboards are wide and scrubbed so many times with sand and river water that the grain stands up under your bare feet like the ridges of a fingerprint. There is a low doorway you have learned to duck without thinking about it, and a smell that is the sum of every fire that has ever burned here. Wood smoke, ash, old grease, dried apple, wool, and underneath it all, faintly, the barn. And there is the hearth. It is enormous, and it is the reason the house exists in the shape it does. You could stand inside it if you stooped. It is the kitchen, the furnace, the light, the clock, and the pulpit of this family. And for the next 5 months it will be the single most important object in your life. Right now, though, there is no fire in it worth speaking of. It is late October, the sun is warm on the south wall, and you have a bushel basket on your hip and somewhere to be. The last warm week of October is a gift, and everybody knows it, which is exactly why nobody sits down. The light has gone low and gold, the way it only does in the back half of the year, coming in sideways under the branches instead of down through them, and it lays long, soft shadows out across the stubble of the harvested field. The air smells like the orchard, not the sharp green smell of summer apples, but the heavier, sweeter, slightly drunken smell of windfalls lying in the grass and going soft. Wasps are drowsing in the bruised ones. You step around them out of professional courtesy. The cider press has been going for days, apples in the hopper, the screw turning, the pomace mounting up in its slabs, the juice running out cloudy and warm and so sweet it makes your back teeth ache. It goes into barrels and down into the cellar, and it does not stay sweet. By Christmas it will be hard, and by February it will be an opinion. Cider is what this county drinks instead of water, partly because it keeps, and partly because everybody agrees it is safer, and historians still argue about how much of the stuff an ordinary household actually got through in a year. The surviving estimates land somewhere that sounds less like a beverage and more like a lifestyle. Your father would say the numbers are exaggerated. Your father would then go check on the barrels. But the pressing is not the real work of late October. The real work is counting. You go down into the cellar with a rushlight and you stand there and you take stock. And this is the moment the year turns from harvest into arithmetic. The cellar is a dugout under the north end of the house, stone-lined, dark and cold in a steady, patient way. A place that stays a few degrees above freezing all winter, and a good deal cooler than the kitchen all summer, which is the entire point of it. The air down there is damp and mineral and faintly sweet from the apples, turnips in sand, parsnips left in the ground on purpose, because frost makes them sweeter, and you can dig them at Christmas if the ground allows, carrots layered in sand, cabbages hung by their roots from the joists like a row of pale green lanterns, apples in straw, laid out so no two are touching because one rotten apple genuinely does take the rest with it. And the proverb was a warehousing instruction long before it was a metaphor about people. Crocks of butter under salt, barrels of cider, an empty barrel or two waiting for something that is still, at this moment, alive and standing in the pen behind the barn. Then out to the corn crib, which is built narrow and slatted so the wind can dry the ears, and raised up, on stones with flat caps on them so that the rats have to be athletes. You count the crib by eye, in bushels, the way you might glance at a bank balance. Corn is what stands between you and disaster in April, because corn feeds the family and the hogs and the milk cow and the horse, and it can be pounded into sop or ground into meal or boiled into something warm at any hour of any bad day. Then the barn, hay in the mow packed tight, fodder, the dried corn stalks and leaves bound in bundles, straw for bedding and for stuffing, oats if it was a good year for oats, and here you do the arithmetic that every colonial household on this continent does in November, out loud at the kitchen table, with a stub of pencil or with no pencil at all. So many mouths, so many weeks, so many bushels. Count the people, 2 adults, the grandmother by the fire, 5 children of assorted usefulness. Count the weeks between now and the first cutting of grass in May, and it comes out to about 26, which is to say half a year in which nothing whatsoever will grow. Count what the cow eats a day and multiply. Count what the horse eats and multiply, and then wince because a horse is a magnificent animal and an absolute glutton. Count the hogs, count the sheep. Then set the 2 columns side by side and look at the difference, and understand, calmly, without drama the way you'd read a tide chart, that the difference is not a number. The difference is a decision about who is going to be alive in the spring. Because here is the thing nobody puts in the paintings. You cannot feed everything through the winter. There is no such thing as buying in more hay in February. The roads are bad. Your neighbours have exactly the same problem you do. And money's a rumour anyway. So the household looks at the barn, looks at the buyer, and coldly, quietly, sorts the animals into 2 lists. The breeding stock lives, the cow in milk, the sow, the ram, the ewes you mean to lamb, the horse or the ox because that is your engine. Everything else is food. The extra pigs, the surplus roosters, the old ewe whose teeth are gone, the steer that has done all the growing it is going to do. These are not pets, and they were never going to be, and every child in this house has known that since they could walk. They still have names. It is entirely possible to name an animal and also to be practical about it, and colonial farm children were remarkably good at both, which is either heartless or wonderfully clear-eyed depending on how far you live from a barn. And hanging over all of this counting is a date. Not a temperature, not a forecast. A date, the killing frost. Every farming family in this county carries a rough sense of when the frost usually comes, learned from their own bad years and their parents' bad years, and they plan against it like a deadline. Everything tender must be in before it. The last of the beans, the pumpkins, the squash hauled in on the sledge, the cabbages either cut or heeled into a trench with earth pulled over them. There is a quirk in all this that delights me. Parsnips and certain turnips are deliberately left out in the freezing ground, because cold turns their starch to sugar. It is the only crop on the whole farm that improves by being abandoned. And when the frost does finally come, hard, white and total, silvering the field and blackening the vines overnight, nobody in the house is surprised and nobody is unprepared. What they are is busy, because the frost is also a starting gun. And the first thing it fires off is the biggest job of the entire year. Wood, not romantic wood. Not a cheerful little stack beside a fireplace in a photograph. 30 or 40 cords of wood, which is a quantity that stops being a decoration and starts being a civil engineering project. A cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of timber, and a household like yours can burn 30 or 40 of them in a year. Line those up end to end, and you have a wall of split wood over 300 feet long, taller than the children and deeper than they are patient. You will not merely burn it. You will fell it, limb it, buck it, haul it, split it, stack it, and then carry it indoors, armload by armload, all winter, in the dark, in your bad shoes. Historians still argue whether that 30 to 40 cord figure is typical or the top end of the range. Some households surely burned less, particularly the ones who'd run out. But nobody argues about the shape of the thing. Heating a timber house with an open hearth is like heating a colander with a match, and the arithmetic never gets kinder. So you go to the woodlot, and you go early, because green wood is a promise to your future self. The felling is done with axes, and the axe you use is a felling axe with a long haft and a thin bit, sharpened on a wet grindstone that somebody's younger sibling has been drafted into turning. Your father sets the face cut low on the trunk on the side he wants the tree to fall, and then works the back cut, and the sound of it goes out across the cold woodlot in a slow double knock, and every so often everything stops so he can look up and read the crown, because a tree with a lean and a hung limb has opinions. Then the crack, a long tearing groan that does not sound like wood so much as like a building giving up, and the whole thing goes over, and the tops of the surrounding trees whip and shudder, and afterward there is a silence so complete that you can hear the leaves still coming down. Then the crosscut saw, 2 men, 1 at each end, and the only rule that matters, you pull, you never push. Push on a crosscut saw and it buckles and binds, and your partner says something unkind about your mother. The rhythm of it is hypnotic once you find it. The long rasping stroke, the shift of weight, the pause, the return, and the sawdust comes out in pale wet ribbons that smell like nothing else on earth. Oak smells sour and tannic. Hickory smells almost like bacon. Cedar smells like your grandmother's chest of blankets. And here is the thing that separates a household that is warm in February from one that is merely surviving it. Green wood, wood cut this month and burned next month, is a slow betrayal. Freshly felled timber is roughly half water by weight, and every drop of that water has to be boiled off before the wood will properly burn. So instead of giving you heat, it takes heat. It hisses, it whistles at the ends, it steams, it smoulders, it sulks. It gives you a fire you have to apologise for. Worse, all that unburnt smoke goes up the flue cool and greasy, and lines the chimney with creosote. And a chimney lined with creosote is not a chimney, it is a fuse. That's why wood is cut a year ahead and stacked to season. The wood you are cutting this autumn is not for this winter, it is for the next one. You are essentially heating a house you have not lived in yet. Which is why snow, when it comes, is greeted in this house with something close to affection. Snow is a road. A loaded sledge that would bog down and break axles on frozen ruts in November will glide over 8 inches of packed snow behind one patient horse. And the heaviest logs, the ones you left lying in the woodlot precisely because they were unmovable, come out of the trees in January almost meekly. Half the serious hauling on this farm waits for snow. It is the only time of year the weather is on your side, and the household takes full advantage of it, which is how you end up sledding firewood across a field at 11 degrees and calling it a good day, then splitting, which is the honest part, a beetle, a great wooden mallet, and iron wedges and a maul and a round of oak standing on the block. You read the grain, you look for the check that has already opened as the wood dried, you set the wedge in it, and you swing. Straight-grained ash and oak fall open almost politely. Elm does not. Elm has an interlocking grain that laughs at you, and there is a reason nobody writes poetry about splitting elm. And on a cold morning the frozen rounds break more willingly than warm ones, which is one of the few times winter helps. Then the stacking, which is a craft in itself. Bark side up on the outside rows so the rain sheds off. The ends cribbed up in interlocking crosses so the pile stands. Air gaps left everywhere because a stack that cannot breathe cannot dry. And then you stand back and look at it, and what you are looking at is not firewood, it is money. Wood is currency here. It is bartered, willed, litigated over and paid in lieu of coin. Country ministers were routinely paid part of their salary in cordwood delivered to the parsonage door, and a parson with a poor woodlot and a stingy congregation had a very cold vocation indeed. Wood has a market and a price scale by species. In 1794, in the seaboard towns, a cord of oak went for around 10 shillings, and walnut fetched 14 or 15 because walnut burns hotter and cleaner and puts out light as well as heat. Hickory and oak are the aristocrats of the woodpile. Pine is for kindling and for people who enjoy sweeping up sparks. And woodlots, the actual wooded acres, are fought over in wills with a bitterness that surprises people who have never been cold. A farm with no timber is a farm with an expiry date, so when a father divides land among sons, he divides the woodlot too, in narrow strips so that each of them gets a share, and the resulting property lines look like a comb and generate lawsuits for a century. So when your father walks out on a November evening and stands and looks at the woodpile for a moment before coming in, he is not admiring it. He is reading his bank balance, and this year it is good. The rows run the length of the barn wall and stand higher than your head, and he comes back inside with the particular calm of a man whose savings are sound. Which is fortunate because that fuel is about to go to war with the building it is meant to be heating. The house, understand, is not on your side, not exactly. It is a beautiful thing structurally. That oak frame, hand-hewn. The marks of the broadex still walking down the beams in shallow scallops, joints numbered with Roman numerals scribed into the wood so the raising crew knew which post met which girt. But it was raised by people who understood joinery far better than they understood physics. And the physics is where you live. At the centre of it, holding the whole plan together, is the chimney. Not a chimney against a wall, a great stone stack in the middle of the building, wide as a small room at its base, with the kitchen hearth opening off one side and a smaller fireplace off another. Everything in the house is arranged around it, like villagers around a well. And because it is stone, and because stone hoards heat slowly and gives it back slowly, that central mass is quietly radiating warmth into the middle of the house at 4 in the morning long after the fire has gone to embers. It is the closest thing to central heating anybody has. The trouble is the fire itself. An open hearth is a magnificently inefficient device. The great majority of the heat it makes goes straight up the flue and out into the New Jersey sky, and, this is the cruel part, as all the hot air rushes up the chimney it has to be replaced. So the fire pulls. It drags cold air in behind it through every gap in the building, under the door, around the window frames, up between the floorboards, down from the loft. Sit in front of a roaring hearth on a January night and you will find your face and shins pleasantly roasting while a steady river of freezing air runs across the back of your neck and around your ankles. Colonial people did not sit facing the fire because it was cosy. They sat facing the fire because their front and their back were living in 2 different climates, and they had to choose one. Hence the settle, that tall, high-backed, wing-sided wooden bench that looks so uncomfortable in museums. It is not furniture, it is a windbreak. On the coldest mornings you will wake and find that the inside of the window glass has ice on it. Real ice, burned and feathered on the inside, and that the water left standing in the bucket by the door has skinned over. Parts of the room, the corners furthest from the hearth, will not rise above freezing all day no matter how the fire is fed, which is why the family eats and works in the smallest room it can manage. The rule was simple and universal, that the bigger the room, the harder it is to heat, and grand halls were for people with more pride than sense. Your best room, the one with the good chairs, will stand shut and dark and cold as a churchyard from November to March, and it will be opened for exactly 2 things, a wedding and a funeral. Before the cold sets in properly, the house is armoured. This is called banking. You go around the outside of the building and you heap up against the foundation whatever you have. Straw leaves raked from the orchard, cornstalks spent bedding, brush, and earth shovelled over the top to hold it all down. It rises a foot or two up the sill, sometimes higher, an unlovely brown skirt around the whole house, and it stops the wind from scouring under the floorboards and freezing the cellar. Straw is stuffed into the gaps around window frames. Rags are wedged where the clapboards have shrunk. The house goes into winter looking like something a large bird built. And then there is bed, which in this century is a serious piece of technology. There is no mattress as you would know one. There is a wooden frame, and stretched across it, a lattice of rope woven through holes in the rails pulled tight with a bed key. A little wooden lever you use to take up the slack. Rope stretches and sags, and a sagging bed rope makes for a night spent folded like a letter, so the ropes get tightened regularly. Historians still argue about whether the phrase sleep tight actually comes from this practice, or is a much later invention that simply sounds too good to give up. The sensible money is on the latter, but every guide in every historic house in America will tell you the first one, and honestly, let them. On the ropes goes a tick, a big cloth sack, stuffed with straw or corn husks for the children and for the parents. If the family has done well, feathers. Goose down, saved and plucked and hoarded over years, listed in wills right alongside the silver, because a good feather bed was worth roughly what a cow was worth. It crackles when you get into it, or it sighs, depending which one you have got. Over you goes wool, blankets, coverlets, a quilt, and every spare garment in the house on the worst nights. Around the whole bed hang curtains, and they are not decoration either. Draw them closed, and the bed becomes a small tent that traps your own body heat, and inside that tent the temperature climbs into something civilized, while the room around it stays somewhere between a cellar and a grave. And before you get in, the bed is warmed. The warming pan comes off its hook, a shallow round brass or copper pan on a long wooden handle with a lid, filled with embers scooped from the hearth, and somebody runs it back and forth between the sheets in quick sweeps, never pausing, because pausing scorches the linen, and there is a family story about that which will never be allowed to die. Failing that, there are bricks and flat stones that have been sitting in the hearth all evening, wrapped now in flannel and pushed down to the foot of the bed where your feet will find them. Stone bottles filled with hot water do the same work. By morning they are cold as the floor, and stubbing a toe on one is a specific and memorable pain. You sleep in a nightcap, and so does every adult in the house, and so does the grandmother, because a bare head in an unheated room loses heat at a rate you can genuinely feel. Nobody in 1776 thinks a nightcap looks silly. Everybody in 1776 thinks a cold head looks stupid. And the bedroom itself is not a place where anyone lingers. It is a place you sprint through. You undress at the hearth downstairs, you carry your candle up the stairs, you cross the freezing floorboards on your toes in about 4 strides, and you go into the bed like a man going into water. In the morning you reverse it, snatching your clothes from where they were left near the chimney, and dressing at a speed that would impress a soldier. That is the truce, and it holds best on the coldest, clearest, hardest mornings, which, as it happens, is exactly the kind of morning the whole neighbourhood has been waiting for. You know it before you open your eyes. The house is silent in that particular way. It goes silent when the air outside has hardened. No drip from the eaves, no creak of a damp branch, just a stillness with an edge on it. And when you crack the shutter, the whole world is white and stiff and glittering. The field is furred with frost. The mud in the yard is frozen into little ridges and hoofprints as sharp as sculpture. And the last apples on the tree have gone to glass. The first hard frost, which means today is hog-killing day, and it has been decided by the weather rather than by anyone in the family, which is how most important dates around here get set. The logic is exact and unforgiving. You cannot do this in warm weather, because you will be handling several £100 of fresh meat over the course of a day with no ice, no refrigeration, and no second chances, and warmth is how a winter's food becomes a winter's disaster. But you cannot do it in a deep freeze either, because you need water that runs, hands that still work, and men who can hold a knife. So you want a day cold enough to keep the meat and warm enough to work in, and that day is generally the first hard frost, which the whole neighbourhood has been watching for as closely as sailors watch a barometer. So the neighbours come, and they come before light. You hear them arriving in the dark, the creak of a cart, a dog, a low laugh, a man's voice saying something short and being answered by 3 others, lanterns swinging low across the frozen yard, 2 families from up the road, an uncle, a pair of cousins, somebody's hired man, and every one of them is here because 3 weeks from now you will all do this again at their farm, and after that at the next farm, and so on down the road until everyone's barrels are full. Nobody is paid, nobody keeps accounts. This is the oldest currency in the county, older than shillings, older than the ledger at the store, and it is called We Will Need You Too. The fires are already going. The great kettle is set on stones with wood roaring under it, and a second fire under the scalding tub, and by the time the sky goes grey behind the tree line there is steam standing up off the water into the cold air in white columns, and the whole yard smells like wood smoke and wet iron. We will let the killing itself go by quietly, at a distance, the way the children were sent to the far side of the barn for it, done quickly by the most experienced hand present, because everyone here understands that clumsiness is the one true cruelty, and nobody wants to be the man who was clumsy. Then the work begins, and the work is a machine made of people, into the scalding tub which has to be judged by feel and by long experience, hot enough to loosen the bristles, not so hot that it sets them, and the old hands test it by dipping a finger and counting, or by watching the surface, and they will argue about the right temperature for the rest of their lives. In and turned and out, and then everyone crowds in with scrapers, some proper iron ones, some just the bowl of a worn spoon or the lid of a can, and the bristles come away in sheets, and the hide goes pale and clean. Nothing is wasted, and that includes the bristles which are saved and sold on for brushes. There is a fine old detail here that I love. For years, the very best paint and shaving brushes in the world were made from exactly this. The winter bristle of a farm hog scraped off in a frozen yard by somebody's aunt, then hung on a stout pole between two trees or from the beam of the barn, head down and opened, and the internal heat goes out of it into the cold morning in a great slow breath of steam. The offal is claimed immediately. The liver goes straight to the house for tonight's supper, because liver will not keep, and today is the one day of the year it is eaten fresh and eaten fried and eaten with everybody in the room happy about it. Then it hangs and cools and everyone gets bread and cider, and the men stand around the fire telling the same 3 stories they told last year. And then the cutting, which happens indoors on the long table and outdoors on planks, and which turns an animal into a vocabulary. The hams off the hind legs, the shoulders off the front, the sides, the belly, the jowls, the ribs, the loin. The hams and shoulders and sides are the prizes. They will be salted. They will hang in the smokehouse. They will be the thing you eat in March when nothing else is left. The trimmings go into a heap for sausage, and the women grind and season it. Sage and pepper and salt in proportions that are family property and are not written down anywhere and never will be. The head is boiled long and slow, and its meat picked off and pressed into a loaf with its own jelly. Head cheese, which every child claims to hate and every child eats. And in the great kettle all day the fat is rendering. Cut small, thrown in, stirred with a long paddle, kept just below the point where it would scorch, until the clear lard runs and is ladled off into crocks and jars. And lard is not a byproduct. Lard is a treasure. It is the whole year's frying, the pastry, the sealing fat poured over potted meat, the base of soap, the grease for the lamps. And when the fat has given everything it has, what is left in the bottom of the kettle are the cracklings, brown and crisp and hot. And these are handed to the children on the spot, straight out of the kettle, too hot to hold, passed hand to hand and blown on and eaten anyway. Ask any adult in America a century later what hog killing day smelled like, and they will not say the fires or the blood. They will say cracklings. The whole farm smells of it. Smoke, fat, sage, boiling water, cold mud. It goes on all day, and it does not feel like a chore. It feels like a fair. There are more people in your yard today than on any day since the raising of the barn. There is shouting and joking and somebody singing badly, and the dogs are beside themselves, and the small children are running underfoot on a sugar high of cracklings, and the grandmother is directing operations from a chair by the fire, with the absolute authority of a woman who has done this 50 times. And then, quite suddenly, it is over. The light goes, the neighbours load up and go home, the fires are damped, and the exhaustion arrives all at once. The specific exhaustion of a day spent on your feet in the cold with your sleeves wet to the elbow. Your back is a rumour. Your hands smell of fat and will smell of fat for 3 days. But nothing is finished. The meat is butchered, not preserved, and butchered meat is a clock running down. It is lying there in the cold shed on clean boards, the hams and shoulders and sides, waiting for the one thing that will turn it from food for a week into food for a winter. And in the corner of the shed stands the barrel, and beside the barrel stands the salt box, and your mother opens the lid of that box and looks inside for a long moment without saying anything at all. Historians still argue about exactly how bad the shortage was in each county that autumn, but nobody argues about the direction of it. there is a war on, and there is a blockade on the coast and salt does not grow in New Jersey. The barrels are ready. That is the part that will keep you awake tonight. They are standing in a row at the foot of the cellar stairs, staved and hooped and scoured out with hot water and a birch broom until the oak smells faintly sweet, and they are waiting to be filled, and the thing that is supposed to fill them is not in the house. You have the meat. The meat is hanging in the cold air of the outbuilding right now, cooling, waiting, doing the one thing meat is very good at doing, which is slowly becoming a problem. What you do not have in anything like the quantity you need is salt. It has been coming for months, this shortage, in the way bad news comes on a farm, slowly, and then all at once, and then in the form of a neighbour in your doorway with his hat in his hands asking whether you have any to spare. Salt was never something anyone grew. It came in ships, from the salt pans of Portugal and Spain, from the Turks Islands, from Liverpool, from anywhere with sunshine and seawater and men willing to rake white crust into heaps, and then up the Delaware into the warehouses of Philadelphia, and you bought it by the bushel and never once thought about it, which is the highest compliment a household can pay to anything. Then the Royal Navy arrived off the coast and stopped being a distant political abstraction and started being a wall. The blockade did not have to be perfect to be devastating. It only had to be inconvenient enough that insurers and captains began doing arithmetic, and salt, being heavy and cheap and bulky, is the first cargo to stop moving when the arithmetic goes sour. In Philadelphia, the price of a bushel went from something like £2 to something like £7, a fourfold jump in a thing half the province needed inside a 6-week window, which is roughly the economic equivalent of announcing a shortage of buckets on the morning the barn catches fire. The Reverend Henry Muhlenberg, the great Lutheran patriarch of Pennsylvania, a man who spent his life writing down what he saw with a kind of exhausted precision, recorded that the people push and jostle each other whenever there is a small quantity of salt to be found. It is a very small sentence containing a very large amount of fear. These are not desperate strangers in a famine. These are farmers and farmers' wives and respectable church-going people who 3 months ago would have apologised for brushing your sleeve, elbowing one another at a warehouse door over a commodity you could once buy for pennies. Muhlenberg was not writing about hunger that day. He was writing about the anticipation of hunger, which arrives earlier and hits harder. The colonies did what colonies do, which is legislate at it. In the spring of 1776, New Jersey, Maryland, North Carolina and Connecticut all passed acts to encourage the making of salt at home. Bounties, loans, exemptions, encouragement of every flavour short of actually going down to the shore and boiling it themselves. The Continental Congress, on the 17th of April, set a bounty of its own for homemade salt and told the local committees of observation to watch for profiteering. And here is the quiet, slightly alarming part. Those committees were your neighbours, the same men you saw at the mill and argued with about a line fence, now deciding whether a merchant's price was patriotic or criminal. In several Maryland counties, farmers dispense with the paperwork altogether and simply seize stores of salt outright, on the reasoning that a warehouse full of salt in such a season was less a private business than a public utility. Historians still argue whether those seizures should be understood as revolutionary crowd action, with a moral logic behind it, or simply as a great many frightened people helping themselves and inventing the principle afterward. And the honest answer is probably that the participants would not have found the distinction very interesting. Along the Monmouth shore, meanwhile, men were building salt works on the sedge flats behind the barrier beaches. Sheds, furnaces, and great flat iron pans, some of them large enough, that you could have laid a grown man across one and had room for his hat. You pump or bale seawater into the pans, and you boil and you boil and you skim, and eventually a grey-white crust forms that is not as clean or as fine as the imported article, and does not matter in the slightest because it is salt. The catch is fuel. It takes an appalling quantity of cordwood to boil a pan of seawater down to anything you can carry. So the works ate the shore pines the way a hungry man eats bread, and the smoke went up in a column visible from a long way off, including, unfortunately, from the sea. The British raided those works repeatedly through the war, burning the sheds and staving the pans, because a navy that understands blockade understands that a kettle of boiling seawater is a kind of ordnance. So that is the world outside. Here is what it means in your own kitchen, which is where it truly bites. Salt is not a seasoning in this house. Salt is time. Salt is the machine that turns a hog into 11 months of dinners. Without it, the meat hanging in the cold house is not a winter's provision. It is a deadline, and every hour of mild weather shortens it. So you ration. The strong salt goes where it must, into the hams and shoulders and the great brine barrels, and you skimp everywhere else, and you eat the perishable cuts first and fastest, which is why the week after killing is, paradoxically, the best fed week of the whole year. You boil the old brine and use it again, grey and cloudy and smelling like the inside of a ship. You send a boy 11 miles with a shilling and a sack and instructions to come back with whatever he can find, and you notice with a certain grim clarity that even the cattle miss it standing at the fence licking the boards where the salt used to be put out, entirely uninterested in the constitutional issues involved. Down the trap door, then, because that is where all of this is going. The ring is cold in your fingers, the boards come up with a groan they have made for 40 years, and you go down the ladder backward with a candle held awkwardly at chest height, into air that changes as you descend, the sharp kitchen air giving way to something heavier, damper, older, smelling of earth and apples and the ghost of last year's turnips. This is the cellar, the single most important piece of technology your family owns. The house keeps you alive, the cellar keeps you fed, which turns out to be the same sentence with a longer fuse. It is dug below the frost line and walled with dry-laid fieldstone, and its whole purpose is to sit in a narrow band of temperature. Very cold, never freezing. Too warm and everything rots. Too cold and everything freezes, then thaws into mush, which is rot with extra steps. The earth does the regulating for you, slowly and stupidly and reliably, and on a still day down here you can hold your hand out and feel absolutely nothing happening, which is precisely the desired outcome. Along one wall stand the boxes of sand, carrots and parsnips and beets layered in it like fossils, tops trimmed, not quite touching, the sand keeping them plump and stopping them from wilting into leather. Straw does the same work in a pinch. Cabbages are their own species of nonsense, pulled with the roots on and hung from the joist by those roots, or buried head down in a pit outside under heaped earth, so that in February you go out with a spade and dig up a vegetable like a man robbing a very small and very disappointing grave. Turnips and potatoes go in bins in the dark. Onions want the opposite, dry, airy, braided and hung sulking in a corner. The apples are the aristocracy. They are laid out on shelves or in straw, and the iron rule is that they must not touch one another, because one bad apple genuinely does spoil the barrel, a piece of household physics so familiar that Benjamin Franklin had printed the proverb in Poor Richard's almanac decades earlier. The rotten apple spoiling his companion. You walk the shelves every week or two with a candle, turning them, pulling out any that have gone soft. Those go to the cider barrel or the pigs or the pot. Nothing in this house dies of a single cause. Everything is demoted through a series of ever less dignified purposes until it is finally either eaten or burned. At the far end are the barrels, and the barrels are where the salt went. Pork packed tight, layer on layer, each rubbed and salted, the whole thing topped with brine strong enough to float an egg. That was the test, and there is something very pleasing about a technology whose calibration instrument is an egg. In the first weeks the meat settles. You will hear it if you're down here alone and quiet. A soft, slow shifting inside the wood, a creak, a small liquid sigh as the pieces compact and the brine finds its level. You will also learn to dread the day the brine goes ropey and slick, because then it must be poured off and boiled and skimmed and put back, and the whole cellar smells like a harbour for a week. Not everything goes in brine. Some of the pork and most of the bacon and the great hams go to the smoke. Either the smokehouse, if you have one, windowless, with a fire pit and no chimney. Worth the name, or else hung high in the kitchen chimney itself, up in the throat where the meat can hang for days in a slow drift of hickory and applewood smoke. Smoke dries the outside and lays down a coat of compounds that mould and insects dislike, which means a properly smoked ham is armoured. The side effect is that everything in the house smells of it, including your hair, your bedding, and by March, arguably your personality. Then drying, the cheapest preservation of all, because the only ingredient is patience. Apples are peeled and cored and cut into rings and strung on linen thread, and the strings hang across the kitchen and up in the garret in long loops that shrink and darken over weeks until they are leathery and sweet. Pumpkin is cut in rings and hung the same way. Herbs go up in bunches in the garret. Sage, thyme, summer savoury, pennyroyal, dill head down in the dry, warm air under the roof, and when you go up there on a cold day the whole space smells like the inside of a summer that has been folded up and put away. In the German households hereabouts there is one more barrel, and it is doing something none of the others do. It is alive. Cabbage shredded fine, salted, packed down under a weighted board until its own juice rises over the top, and then left to ferment into sauerkraut. It bubbles. It smells frankly assertive. It also happens to be one of the few things on this continent that keeps a family supplied with vitamin C through a 5-month winter, though nobody in 1776 could have told you why, only that people who ate it came through the cold months better. Historians still argue about how much credit fermented cabbage deserves for the general health of Pennsylvania German households, and it is a small, faintly comic scholarly quarrel that would nonetheless have been of enormous interest to any 18th century sailor with loose teeth. Last, there is potting, cooked meat pounded fine with spice, packed into a crock sealed under a poured lid of clarified fat that hardens into an airtight cap. It is refrigeration by grease, and it works. In November, this cellar is a cathedral. It is full, and it smells of apples and earth and cured meat and sweet oak, and you can stand at the bottom of the ladder with a candle and feel, honestly, wealthy. Remember that feeling? In March, the same cellar will smell of sprouting potatoes and sour brine and old cabbage water. The shelves will be gappy. The apples will be wrinkled as knuckles, and you will stand in exactly the same spot, holding exactly the same candle, doing arithmetic. Same room, different religion. Nobody in this house drinks much water, and it is not because of stubbornness. It is because water in 1776 is a matter of guesswork. Your well may be clean, and it may not. The spring below the barn is downhill from a great many things that a thoughtful person would prefer to be uphill from, and the plain fact is that people who drank a lot of plain water in crowded places sometimes got very sick, and people who drank cider generally did not. Nobody understands the mechanism. Everyone has observed the result. So the household runs on cider and small beer and milk when there is milk, and tea when tea is politically and financially available, which at present it is neither. The cider begins in October, in the noise. The apple mill is a heavy wooden trough with a toothed roller turned by a crank or a patient horse walking a circle, and it crushes the apples into a wet brown mash called pomace, and the whole yard smells like a bruised orchard for a fortnight. The pomace goes onto the press bed in layers, wrapped in straw or coarse cloth. Cheeses, they are called, stacked one on another like a tower of very sticky mattresses, and then the great screw comes down, turned with a long lever, one groaning quarter turn at a time, and the juice comes out. First in a rush, then a stream, then a trickle you keep waiting on, because you are not going to leave good cider in the straw. It runs sweet and cloudy and faintly warm from the friction, and every child within a half-mile finds a reason to be standing nearby with a cup. Into the barrels it goes, and here is the thing that modern people find hard to believe. You do not have to make it alcoholic. It simply does that. Wild yeast is already on the apple skins and in the wood of the press and in the air of the barn, and by Christmas that sweet cider will be hard whether anybody in the household intended it or not, sitting at something like 6%, and by spring well on its way to vinegar unless you manage it. There is no moral decision in here anywhere. There is only chemistry with a calendar. The quantities startle people. A New England or New Jersey farm household could easily go through several barrels of cider a year, 30 gallons to a barrel, and estimates running to a barrel or more per person annually in cider country. Children included, though the children's cup was cut with water. Cider was money. Hired hands were paid partly in it. It went in the accounts as rent, as wages, as neighbourly settlement of a debt for a day's ploughing. John Adams, who was in no sense a dissolute man, drank a gill of hard cider every morning before breakfast for most of his adult life, and lived to be 90, which is the sort of fact that should not be used as medical advice but frequently is. Beside the cider there is small beer, brewed at home in the kitchen from malt or from bran or from molasses and hops and whatever else is going, and drunk within days because it will not keep. It is weak, cloudy, faintly sweet, more a food than a drink, and it is what goes in the field jug at harvest and in the mug at breakfast. Recipes for it are scribbled in the backs of household books between remedies for a cough and instructions for dyeing wool, which tells you exactly how ordinary it was. And then, on a cold night when a neighbour has come by, or the household has simply decided that this particular Tuesday deserves recognition, there is flip. Flip is beer and rum and sugar or molasses, mixed in a heavy pitcher or a tall glass. And then, and this is the good part, somebody takes the loggerhead out of the fire. A loggerhead is an iron rod with a bulb on the end, kept sitting in the coals until it glows, and it goes straight down into the mug. The drink erupts, it foams, it hisses, it throws up a sudden cloud of scorched sugar steam, and it comes out hot and bitter-sweet with a burnt caramel edge that no modern drink really reproduces. Then everybody has one, and the conversation gets both louder and less accurate. Historians still argue about just how heavily 18th century Americans actually drank. since the surviving import figures are enormous, but the population was doing hard physical labour, drinking weak beverages all day and rarely on an empty stomach. But nobody disputes that the loggerhead existed, or that it was also occasionally used to settle arguments in a way its inventor did not intend. The rum, though, is a problem this year, and the molasses with it. Both come from the West Indies. Up the same sea lanes the Royal Navy is currently making a nuisance of itself along, and that trade is precisely what a blockade exists to strangle. Some things have simply stopped appearing. It gives the whole autumn a curious flavour, this business of a war fought partly over trade being felt at your kitchen table as the absence of sweetness. Which brings you finally to the tavern, because on a cold night that is where a good deal of this is happening. Every village has one, usually with a name and a painted sign, a stag, a ship, a king's head that somebody may recently have repainted into something less provocative, and it is reliably the warmest room for miles. There is a great fire kept up all evening, there are settles pulled close, there is a bar cage of turned spindles to keep the liquor honest, and there is a landlord who knows everybody's credit. It is not primarily a place to get drunk. It is the post office, the newsroom, the courthouse, the labour exchange, and the town's collective memory. The newspapers arrive there. Travellers arrive there, shaking snow off their hats, and are immediately interrogated. Militia muster there. Committees meet there. If there is news from New York or Philadelphia, it reaches your farm because somebody rode home from the tavern with it, and by the time it reaches your door it has been improved a little, in the way that news carried 9 miles in the cold always is. The flax field was harvested by pulling the whole plant out of the ground by the roots rather than cutting it, because you want every last inch of fibre, and the fibre is the stem. That was July. What is happening now, in the tail of the year, is everything that comes after. The long, filthy, noisy, months-long argument between a plant and a family about whether it is going to become a shirt. First, the flax was retted, which is a polite word for controlled rotting. Bundles were laid in the pond or in a slow ditch, or spread on the grass for the dew, and left for a week or two while bacteria ate away the gum binding the useful fibre to the useless woody core. Pond retting is faster and smells like a crime. Everyone in the household can tell you the day the flax is ready without going outside. Take it out too soon and the fibre will not separate. Leave it too long and the fibre itself rots, and you have spent a summer growing a very expensive nothing. Then the dried stalks meet the brake and the noise starts. A flax brake is a hinged wooden jaw. You feed handfuls of stalk into it and slam the top down, over and over, crack, 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 all afternoon, snapping the brittle woody core into short pieces called shivs while the long fibres survive. Then scutching. You drape the beaten handful over an upright board and beat it downward with a wooden blade, a flat swishing thwack, and the shivs fly off in a shower of chaff that gets into your eyes, your hair, your collar, and the food. Then hackling, combing the fibre through beds, of iron spike set in a block coarse to fine, each pass pulling out the shorter tangled fibres called tow, and leaving the long silky line hanging over your hand like pale hair. Tow becomes rope and sacking. Line becomes shirts and sheets. One old estimate held that turning flax into finished linen took 12 distinct operations across most of a year, which explains why nobody in this house owns very many shirts, and why the ones they do own get named in wills. Wool runs on a parallel track. The sheep was sheared in the late spring, the fleece washed to get the grease and the field out of it, then carded, 2 paddles faced with fine bent wire, wool drawn between them again and again until the fibres lie parallel, then rolled off into a soft airy cylinder called a rolag. Carding is the job given to children and to anyone who is talking, because it requires hands and not attention. Then spinning, and wool goes on the great wheel, the big one taller than the woman working it, turned by hand with no treadle at all. She draws the roving out at arm's length as the spindle twists it, steps backward, then walks forward feeding the finished yarn on, then draws and steps back again. Do that for a working day, and the estimates suggest a spinner covered several miles across her own kitchen floor without going anywhere at all, which is either a comment on domestic labour or on the 18th century in general. Flax is spun on the small wheel with a foot treadle, sitting down, fingers wetted, and the thread it makes is the warp, strong and smooth and unforgiving. Wool is softer and warmer and weaker, so you combine them, and that is linsey woolsey, a linen warp with a wool weft, the workhorse cloth of the whole colonial world, cheap and warm and nearly indestructible and nobody's idea of elegant. Everyday gowns, petticoats, waistcoats, children's clothes, all linsey woolsey. Woolen cloth off the loom is loose and open, so it goes to be fulled. soaked in warm water with fuller's earth or urine, then pounded by hand and foot or under the hammers of a fulling mill on a stream, until the fibres mat and shrink and lock together into something dense and windproof. Fulled cloth is what stands between a man and a January northwester. Fulling mills were among the earliest industrial machines in the colonies, and the fuller was a man everyone knew, and nobody entirely trusted about shrinkage. Then colour. Indigo, imported from South Carolina, sits in a vat that ferments and reeks and turns cloth an astonishing green as it comes out, which oxidizes to blue in the open air, chemistry so satisfying that children were allowed to watch. Madder root gives red-orange, and takes patience. Walnut hulls, gathered green and left to rot in a bucket until they are black, give a brown that will not wash out of your hands for about 3 weeks. Iron kettles and copper kettles shift every colour they touch, which is why one family's blue is not another family's blue. Spinning bees gathered a dozen women and their wheels in one house, or on the minister's lawn, and turned a solitary chore into the best day of the month, and after the non-importation agreements they became something more pointed. Wearing homespun stopped being a matter of thrift and became an argument you could conduct while standing still. Graduating classes at colleges took their degrees in homespun. Newspapers printed the yardage produced at spinning meetings the way they printed election results. If you appeared at meeting in imported broadcloth in 1775, nobody said anything, and everybody noticed. Historians still argue whether homespun ever replaced imported cloth in any serious quantity, or whether its real power was always symbolic, but symbols that you have to card, spin, weave, full and dye yourself tend to be believed. Knitting fills every remaining crack in the day. Stockings, mittens, caps, worked by firelight, worked while minding a pot, worked in the saddle by women who had 4 needles going and a horse that knew the road, and under everything, layers, shift or shirt next to the skin, then petticoats or breeches and waistcoat, then a coat, then a cloak, then a shawl over that, feet in cowhide shoes stuffed with wool or straw, or wooden pattens strapped underneath to lift you out of the mud, or, if the year has gone badly, wrapped in rags and tied. And in an unheated bedroom in January, nobody really undresses. You take off the outer layer, keep the shift on, add a cap, and get into the bed with everyone else. Modesty and hypothermia arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions. The war has been, until this autumn, a thing that happened in newspapers. It happened at Boston, which is far away, and at Quebec, which is farther, and then at New York, close enough to be interesting but still on the other side of a river and somebody else's problem. You have followed it the way you follow weather in another county. Men rode home from the tavern with names and numbers, and the names were argued over by the fire, and everybody went back out and finished the ploughing because whatever else is true, the ploughing does not care. That stops in November. On the 16th, Fort Washington falls on the upper end of Manhattan, and it does not fall slowly. It goes in a single day, and something close to 3,000 men march out as prisoners. 3,000? Say it in terms you understand. More men than live in your township, your county town, and every village you have ever walked to. Gone in an afternoon, and most of them into prison ships and churches from which a great many will not come back. 4 days later, on the 20th, Fort Lee on the Jersey Palisades is abandoned in a hurry so complete that the garrison leaves tents standing, and according to the story everyone tells afterward, kettles still boiling over the fires. Whether that detail is literally true, or has been polished in the retelling hardly matters. It is the right image, and the right image travels faster than the correct one, and then the war comes down the road toward you. The Continental Army retreats across New Jersey and Lord Cornwallis follows it. Hours behind rather than days. Newark, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton. The retreat runs the whole length of the province on the same roads your family uses to go to market, which means that for weeks you stand at your own fence and watch an army go past. First the men, not the army of the recruiting broadside. These are thin, unshaven men in whatever they own, a great many with their feet bound up in rags, marching in a loose, unbeautiful column with the mud coming over their shoes. They do not look at you much. Somebody's fifer is playing and somebody else is telling him, at length, to stop. Then the wagons, and guns dragged by horses too long on the road, and after them the other river, which is worse, refugees. Families off farms nearer the coast, coming inland with a cart or a wheelbarrow, a cow being led, a child on top of the load, everything they could not carry left standing in a house behind them. They stop at your well, they ask for the road. Some of them ask whether they can sleep in the barn, and you say yes, because you have looked at them and understood something about arithmetic and luck. An army passing your farm is not a battle. It is a slow subtraction. The rail fences go first because a rail fence is essentially firewood that somebody has kindly pre-split and stacked in long convenient rows every 100 yards, and a cold man at midnight has an entirely different theory of property than you do. Then the well is drunk dry, then muddy, then in need of an hour to recover between buckets. The hay goes for the horses. The poultry vanishes without anyone ever quite seeing it happen, which is a considerable trick with geese. And your winter, the cellar, the barrels, the hay, the woodpile, that whole enormous edifice of autumn work turns out to have been built on the assumption that only your family would be eating from it. And with the men come the questions. Which side are you on? Somebody always asks, sometimes politely, sometimes with a hand already on the gate. Your neighbours are not of one mind. This is a province of Quakers who will not fight anybody, Presbyterians who will fight almost anybody, Dutch and German farmers who mostly want to be left alone, and a genuinely large number of people whose loyalty to the crown is sincere and old and has a church pew attached to it. Within a few weeks the British will offer pardons to anyone who signs, and hundreds will sign, and some will sign in the morning and feed the militia in the evening, because the object is not principle. The object is to still have a farm in the spring. Historians still argue whether the Jersey countryside that winter is best described as loyalist, patriot or exhausted, and the strongest evidence points fairly clearly at the third. Meanwhile, everybody is counting toward the last day of December. Most of the continental enlistments expire on the 31st. Not staggered, not renewable by default, expire. Which means that at midnight on the 31st of December, the army retreating past your fence largely ceases to legally exist, and every man in it becomes a private citizen standing in the snow a long way from home with the legal right to walk away. They know it. Their officers know it. Cornwallis knows it, which is why there is no particular hurry on his side. On the 12th of December, the Continental Congress leaves Philadelphia for Baltimore, a decision that requires no interpretation whatsoever from the people watching it happen. So the family holds a conversation, more than once, at night, in low voices, with the children supposedly asleep in the loft. Do you stay, or do you go? Going means loading the wagon, and you have already discovered in the abstract that a wagon holds bedding, seed, tools, the good kettle, the family Bible, and roughly none of the cellar. It means abandoning the hogs you spent a year raising and killed a week ago. It means becoming one of the people at somebody else's well. Staying means being here when whatever is coming arrives, with a full cellar and a good barn, which in the winter of 1776 is not obviously an advantage. Your grandmother settles it with the observation that a farm you leave is a farm you may not get back, and nobody argues with her, partly because she is right and partly because nobody ever does. So you stay. The wagon does not get loaded. The barrels stay in the cellar, the wood stays in the rick, the trapdoor goes down, and the household stands in place while the province comes apart around it. And late one grey afternoon in early December, with the light already going and the wind out of the northwest, you look up from the yard and there are men in the lane, unhurried, in good coats, mounted, quite unlike anything that has passed this week, and they have already stopped at your gate. They come up the lane without hurrying, and that's the first thing you understand about them. Hurry belonged to the other army, the one that went south through November like water looking for a crack in a wall. These men walk the way people walk when they believe the war is finished and only the paperwork remains. Through that December, the British regiments and the hired German ones settle themselves across New Jersey in a chain of posts. New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton, Bordentown, Pennington, and a scattering of smaller stations in between, and a chain of posts translated out of the language of generals and into the language of your own farm lane means that somebody's going to be sleeping in your house. There are nowhere near enough barracks in the province to hold them. There are, however, a great many houses, and yours has a roof, a chimney, a cellar with cider in it, and a barn with hay still in the mow. Quartering is a word that sounds orderly. It sounds like a clerk with a list. What it means in a four-room house is that the front room, the good room, the one with the better chairs and the looking glass your mother brought from Amwell, now belongs to an officer, and the officer has a servant, and the servant has opinions about where the firewood ought to be kept. It means the kitchen holds 11 people instead of 6. It means the loft where the children sleep is full of strangers' packs and strangers' damp wool, and that wool, drying by a fire it did not cut, produces a smell you will remember for the rest of your life. Sheep and sweat and gun oil and a tobacco that is not your tobacco. It means you cook for them, and the milk goes where they say it goes, and your own family eats standing up in the corner of a room you built, saying very little, very quietly in a language half of them cannot follow anyway. They arrive polite, some of them. That is the strange part. There are officers who write receipts in careful copper plate, promising payment for hay and oats at a fair rate. And there are men who sit by the fire and show your youngest how a flint is knapped. And there is a Hessian sergeant with a wife and 3 children in a village you cannot pronounce who cries a little, over his beer and shows you a lock of hair in a paper. And then, 3 miles off, a foraging party takes a farm apart down to the door hinges. Both things are true in the same week, on the same road, and holding both of them in your head at once is one of the small quiet exhaustions of that winter. What the foraging parties take is documented in a way that still makes uncomfortable reading, because after the war New Jersey sent commissioners around the counties to write it all down, farm by farm, item by item, and those inventories of damages survive. The lists are not dramatic, that is what makes them terrible. 6 pewter plates, 1 brass kettle, 2 feather beds and the ticking of a third, a warming pan, a pepper box, 11 bushels of buckwheat, a pair of shoe buckles belonging to a child, 1 looking glass, broken, window glass, actual glass, prized out of the sashes, because glass was imported and expensive and a soldier could sell it, leaving square holes stuffed afterward with rags and old hats. Fences go first and go fastest, because a post and rail fence is simply firewood that has been standing up politely for years, waiting to be noticed, and a regiment can burn a mile of fencing in a fortnight, after which the cattle wander wherever they please, and nobody can prove whose cow is whose. Livestock is driven off, horses especially, hay especially. The barn empties in an afternoon, so you hide things, which is what everyone does. The good pewter goes into a sack, and the sack goes into a hole in the orchard under the 3rd tree, the one that never fruits properly, and you mark it in your head by the angle of a branch, and you tell exactly one other person. Deeds and the family Bible go under the floor of the henhouse, because nobody searches a henhouse twice. The cattle go into the swamp at the back of the woodlot, standing hock deep in black water among the alders, and you go out at dusk with a boy and a rope and you keep them quiet. And if a cow chooses that moment to bawl at the moon, you find out what your own heart sounds like from the inside. Historians still argue about whether all this hiding preserved much of anything in the long run, or whether it simply moved the loss from December to March, when the hidden hay had rotted and the swamp cattle had gone thin and lame. Both, probably. Most things that winter were both. There is paper that is supposed to prevent all of it. When the Howe brothers issued their proclamation at the end of November, offering pardon and protection to anybody who would come in within 60 days and swear allegiance to the king, thousands of New Jersey men did exactly that, and were given protection papers, signed, official, properly worded. People carried them folded in a pocket the way you would carry a charm, and a protection paper is a wonderful thing right up until the moment a tired foraging party at 4 in the afternoon decides it cannot read, whereupon the paper turns out to be worth precisely 1 sheet of paper. Some men waved theirs and were ignored. Some waved theirs and were mocked. Some kept theirs and lost the farm anyway, and then discovered that the neighbours who had not signed now regarded them as something worse than robbed. Because that is the other thing occupation does, and it does it quietly without any drums. It sets neighbours against each other. A man who signed and a man who did not sign the same hymn book last spring. Somebody tells the British where the militia captain's horses are pastured. Somebody else remembers it and writes it down in the back of his mind in ink that will not wash out for 30 years. Committees of safety start keeping their own lists. There are farms in Hunter, Don and Somerset counties where the war was never really the British against the Americans at all. It was the Van Dykes against the Stouts, or one branch of a family against the other branch, with the armies simply providing the weather. And so you learn to dread a knock after dark, not the daylight knock, which is usually a requisition and a receipt in a hard afternoon. The one after dark when the fire is banked and the house is finally quiet, and boots come up the frozen lane, and you lie there listening and counting them and doing arithmetic you never wanted to be good at. You have a candle by the bed and you do not light it. You hear your father go down. You hear the bar lift out of its brackets. You hear voices and you cannot make out a word, and the not making out is the worst of it. And then you hear the bar go back, and the footsteps in the lane going away, and the whole house lets out a breath at once. Nothing happened. Nothing happened again tonight. You will lie awake anyway until the sky greys, listening to the ordinary creak of a cold house, and telling yourself, quite reasonably and without believing a syllable of it, that it was almost certainly just the wind. There is a man on that retreat with ink on his fingers, and if you had passed him on the road in November you would not have looked twice. He is 39, English-born, a former corset maker and failed excise officer and failed schoolmaster and failed shopkeeper, a man whose life to that point reads like a list of things that did not work out, and he's walking south with the army through the mud with a coat that has seen better decades. His name is Thomas Paine, and he has already written the pamphlet that talked a good many colonists out of the habit of calling themselves subjects, and now, somewhere in the collapse of Fort Lee and the long grey slog through Newark, he begins another one. The story that everyone repeats is that he wrote it at night, on the head of a drum by the light of a campfire in the middle of a beaten army. It is a marvellous image. It has been painted, engraved, printed on the front of schoolbooks, and read aloud at more banquets than anyone can count. It is also, to be honest with you, contested. Paine himself, later, said something rather less cinematic about beginning it at Newark, and drumheads are curved, and the light of a campfire is not what you would call a stable working environment, and anyone who has ever tried to write a sentence with cold hands will have private doubts about the whole arrangement. Historians still argue whether the drumhead was real, a bit of later polish, or the sort of story that becomes true because it deserves to be. What is not in doubt is the date it reached the world, the 19th of December, 1776, printed at Philadelphia, in a city that at that moment was emptying itself out the southern roads in terror. He signed it, as he had signed the last one, with the name Common Sense, and it opens like this. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Read that again in your head at the speed a tired person actually reads. It is not fancy. There is not a word in it that a farmer in Hunterdon County would have to stop and puzzle over. That is the whole trick of Paine, and it was a deliberate trick. He wrote plainly on purpose, at a time when educated men wrote in long latinate coils with classical allusions bolted on, because he wanted the man mending a harness to understand him on the first pass. The summer soldier, the sunshine patriot. Those are farm words, weather words, words about a friend who helps with the haying and vanishes at slaughter time. And the last clause is quietly clever too, because man and woman is not the standard formula. And in a war where the women were running the farms and hiding the cattle and feeding the occupying army out of their own stores, somebody noticing them in print was not nothing. Now consider how a pamphlet actually gets to you in December of 1777, because the machinery is a good deal more interesting than the machinery we have now. It begins in a printing house that smells of lampblack and vinegar and wet rag paper, and the paper itself is made of rag, of worn-out linen shirts and sheets boiled and beaten into pulp, which means that in a real and slightly delightful sense the pamphlet is made of everybody's old clothes. Printers advertised for rags constantly, because paper was scarce. A boy inks the type with leather balls. A man pulls the press, twice a sheet, all day, and his arms know it. The text goes first into a newspaper, then into a small cheap pamphlet, and copies go out in bundles on the post riders, who carry the mails along the main roads on horseback in stages, changing horses at taverns, moving perhaps 40 or 50 miles in a day when the weather is decent and rather less when it is December and the ruts are frozen into iron. The pamphlet lands at a tavern. That is the crucial point. The tavern is the newspaper office, the post office, the courthouse, the debating society, and the only warm public room within 6 miles. And when something arrives, somebody reads it out. Not everybody in that room can read. In the northern colonies, male literacy was high by the standards of the age, but it was never universal. And reading was taught far more widely than writing, and plenty of good men could work through a psalm slowly, and would rather not attempt a pamphlet in front of company. So one man reads and 20 listen, over the noise of the fire and a dog under the table, and somebody makes him read the first sentence again, and by the third repetition a man by the door who cannot read a word of it has the whole opening by heart and will be able to say it 30 years later to his grandchildren. That is how it travels, mouth to mouth, tavern to mill to meeting house, carried home in people's heads. It is said, and this too has been repeated so often that it has acquired the smooth-worn feel of a coin, that Washington ordered the crisis read aloud to the troops before the crossing, to men who were cold and hungry and whose enlistments expired at the end of the month. Whether every regiment heard it, or some did, or whether it happened in quite that tidy way, is less certain than the schoolbooks suggest. But the timing is real. The thing was printed on the 19th. The boats went into the water on the 25th. 6 days. Your family gets it second hand, the way you get everything. A cousin repeats it. A neighbour has the actual pamphlet and will not lend it out. and eventually somebody reads it at your own kitchen table by a tallow candle that needs snuffing every 4 minutes. And your father, who has spent the month watching men take his fence rails for firewood and sign papers they did not believe, listens to that first sentence about the times that try men's souls, and does not say anything at all and gets up and goes to bank the fire, which is, in its way, a review. 30-odd miles to the southwest, the largest city in North America is coming apart in a manner both extremely dramatic and extremely well documented, and word of it reaches you the way all news reaches a farm, late, garbled, and improved in transit. Philadelphia, in December, of 1776 has something like 30,000 people in it, which makes it enormous by the standards of a place where your idea of a crowd is the churchyard after service. It has paved footways, street lamps, 3 markets, coffee houses, a hospital, a college, and more printers than any other city in the colonies. It also has, by the middle of December, the settled conviction that General Howe is going to walk into it within the fortnight. The Delaware is the only thing between the British at Trenton and the State House, and December rivers have an unhelpful habit of freezing into bridges, so Congress goes. On the 12th of December, the Continental Congress resolves to remove itself to Baltimore, and the delegates who have spent 18 months making speeches about liberty get into carriages and go, which is the sort of thing that produces a great deal of comment at the time and a great deal of comment ever since. They set up in a rented brick house on the corner of Baltimore and Sharp Streets, and carry on legislating from there, in a town they mostly disliked and complained about at length in their letters, one delegate grumbling about the mud and the prices with the particular energy of a man who has just discovered that fleeing is expensive. Historians still argue whether that removal was ordinary prudence, the government sensibly declining to be captured in a single afternoon, or a panic that did more to unnerve the country than the enemy managed all month. Probably it was both, since Congress was quite capable of doing 2 things badly at once. What is left behind is a city in flight, and a city in flight has a particular sound. Wheels, mostly. Carts and wagons and chairs and drays going all day and half the night over the stones, the iron tyres making a racket you can hear 3 streets over, loaded with feather beds and looking glasses and children and clocks and casks and, in at least one case, a full set of shop shutters, because the owner reasoned that if he was going to lose the shop he might as well keep the shutters. Shops close and stay closed. The printers pack their type, which is heavy, and their presses, which are heavier. The ferries run all day. The roads west toward Lancaster and south toward Chester and Wilmington fill up with families walking beside their own furniture, and a good many people simply stay, because they have nowhere to go and no cart to go in, which is the part of every evacuation the paintings leave out. Into this walks Israel Putnam, 60 years old, a Connecticut farmer and tavern keeper with the manners of a man who once, according to a story he never troubled to deny, crawled into a den to shoot a wolf. Washington puts him in command of Philadelphia, and Putnam does not dither. He proclaims martial law. He orders the shops shut, forbids people to be about the streets after 10 at night, sets citizens and soldiers to throwing up defensive works and barricading the ends of streets, and announces that anyone setting the city alight will be dealt with in the shortest possible manner. It is not subtle government. It is not meant to be. There is a nice grim detail in the record that the drums beat through the streets to summon men to the works, and that the taverns of all things were among the few places kept open, because you cannot dig entrenchments in December on nothing but principle. And one man conspicuously does not leave. Robert Morris, merchant, member of Congress, the closest thing the Revolution has to a working banking system, stays in Philadelphia to keep the machinery turning, handling correspondence, chasing supplies, moving money, and doing the deeply unglamorous work of finding hard coin in a country awash in paper that fewer people believe in every week. The story that has come down about Morris is that when Washington needed specie, Morris went out on foot among his fellow merchants, on a holiday, knocking on doors, and came back with the money in bags. Whether it happened quite so neatly, the pattern is right. The army moved on credit, and the credit was largely one stubborn merchant's reputation. It is worth remembering when you picture that winter that somebody had to do the arithmetic. Now pull all the way back from the wheels and the drums, out along the frozen roads to a farmhouse in Hunterdon County where none of this can be seen, and all of it can be felt. The panic reaches you as rumour first, which in 1776 is a kind of weather. It arrives at the mill, Congress has fled. It arrives at the Smiths, the city is burning. It arrives with a boy sent for salt. The British are over the river already, and there was fighting at the ferry, which is entirely false and will be repeated by 4 separate people before Thursday. Then a rider goes past the lane at a hard trot without stopping, and not stopping is itself information, and the whole family stands in the door watching the road long after he's gone, the way you would watch a departing storm. And then, on a grey afternoon, your cousin comes. She has a cart, a borrowed horse, 2 children, a dog that has decided to accompany the family without being invited, a chest, a bed, a churn, a cage with 3 hens, and a quilt over the whole arrangement to keep the sleet off. She has come from nearer the river. She does not want to talk about why. She has been on the road 2 days, and there is ice in the hem of her skirt, and she apologises for arriving without notice, standing in your yard beside everything she owns, and your mother says something short and practical about hot water, and that is that. The bed comes into the front room, the hens go in the barn and immediately quarrel with your hens, and the household, which was already stretched thin over a winter's stores calculated back in October, quietly recalculates itself, and nobody says the number out loud. Christmas comes that year on a Wednesday, and the first thing to understand about it is that for a great many Americans in 1776, it is, quite deliberately, nothing much at all. If you had grown up in Massachusetts or Connecticut instead of New Jersey, the 25th of December would be a day for mending harness. The Puritans had objected to Christmas on the grounds that Scripture nowhere commands it, that the date was borrowed from pagans, and that the way people actually kept it, drinking, feasting, going about in disguises, banging on the doors of their betters and demanding to be given things, was not obviously an act of worship. They were not entirely wrong about that last part. Massachusetts went so far as to legislate, for a stretch in the 17th century, keeping Christmas by feasting or forbearing labour carried a fine of 5 shillings, which is a remarkable amount of money to be fined for having a nice dinner. The law was repealed long before your time, but laws leave a residue in habits, and in plenty of New England towns in 1776 the shops are open. The school is in session, and the ministers are pointedly not preaching about mangers. Go south, though, and the picture flips entirely. In Anglican Virginia, Christmas is a fortnight of open-handed noise. A tutor at a great house on the northern neck left a diary entry from a Christmas a few years earlier, describing being woken at dawn by guns going off around the plantation, the servants coming in for their Christmas boxes, mince pies, a fiddler, dancing that ran past midnight and hunting in between, and the general impression is of a man politely overwhelmed. Firing guns at daybreak is the traditional greeting in a good part of the middle and southern colonies. Christmas is announced the way you would announce a wedding or a fire, by making a bang. And in Pennsylvania, among the German settlements, Christmas is the great holy day of the year and is kept with music. At Bethlehem, the Moravians hold a vigil on Christmas Eve with hymns and famously brass, a trombone choir that plays chorales from the belfry out over the roofs in the frozen Lehigh, which if you have never heard it is an extraordinarily strange and beautiful sound in cold air. Brass carrying much further than it has any right to. They build a putz, a little landscape of moss and figures under the tree in the corner, and they hand out beeswax candles trimmed with red paper to the children, and they sing about a town in Judea that gave their own town its name. That December their buildings are also being turned over to the Continental Army as a hospital, and the sick and wounded come up the road in wagons, so the music that year is played over a good deal of suffering. There is something in that image that stays with people. Your Christmas is none of these. Your Christmas in a Jersey farmhouse, in a county full of Dutch and English and German neighbours who each keep it slightly differently, and are all quietly certain the others are doing it wrong, is mostly a working day. The animals do not know it is a holy day and would not care. The cow is milked, the wood is brought in. The ice on the trough is broken with the back of an axe. What marks the day is dinner, which is better than usual and not lavish. Perhaps a piece of the fresh pork from the killing. Perhaps a fowl, a pudding with dried apples and a little of the hoarded sugar. Mince pie if there is spice in the house, and cider that has been quietly getting more serious since October. Somebody may fire a gun at first light. Somebody will certainly read a chapter aloud. Nobody gets a wrapped present, because the whole apparatus of Christmas gifts as we know it is decades off. What a child might get is a coin, or an orange if you live near a port and the blockade has had an off week, or a new pair of mittens presented without ceremony, on the grounds that the old ones have holes. New Year's Day matters as much or more in the Dutch households, with cakes and visiting and a formal round of calls, and there is no tree. This is worth saying plainly, because the picture in everyone's head wants a tree in it. The decorated Christmas tree does not become an American habit until well into the next century. Historians still argue about the persistent legend that the Hessians at Trenton had one, a candlelit tree in a German officer's quarters on the night everything happened. A story that has been told and retold and painted and put on postcards, and for which the evidence is, let us say, thinner than the affection people have for it. It is a lovely story. It is probably not history. Both things are allowed. The weather, though, is documented, and it is the weather that will matter. The 25th dawns clear enough, with sun coming and going behind cloud and a light wind out of the north, and the temperature somewhere in the upper teens. The kind of cold that is not yet cruel, that pinches the inside of the nose and makes the snow squeak underfoot, and turns every puddle in the lane into a small white lens that a child will step on for the pleasure of the crack. The morning is bright and hard. Water freezes in the bucket by the door. You do the work of the day. By afternoon the sky begins to thicken. It comes on the way it does before serious weather, the light going flat and yellowish, the shadows losing their edges, the cloud coming down until the far woodlot looks nearer than it is. The temperature crawls up into the upper 20s, which is the wrong direction for comfort, because cold that rises before a storm is cold that is about to become wet. The cattle come in without being fetched. The smoke from the chimney stops going straight up and starts lying down along the roof. Your father stands in the yard a minute too long with his hand on the gate, looking northeast, and says what farmers have always said, which is that it will be something before morning. He is right, and it will be, and 11 miles away as the crow flies, on the far bank of a river you've known your whole life, a great many cold men are waiting for exactly that. There is a stretch of the Delaware upstream of Trenton where the road comes down through the trees to a landing, and there is a ferry house at the top of the bank on each side, and if you have ever crossed there in summer, you remember the smell of the water and the racket the planks make under a wagon. On the Pennsylvania side it is McConkey's, on the Jersey side Johnson's. Ordinary places, a tavern room, a fireplace, a bar for licensed drink, a stable, a set of scows for the horses and a landing worn smooth. In peacetime the biggest thing that happens there is an argument about the fare. On Christmas night in 1776 the road down to that landing is full of men. They begin gathering at dusk in the woods above the ferry, and it takes an unreasonably long time, because moving 2,500 men and 18 guns and their horses down a single frozen farm track in the dark, without noise, is a task that sounds simple only to people who have never tried to move 6. The password is given out along the line, and it is not a comforting one. Victory or death. Say that aloud once, quietly, and you will notice that it does not offer a third option. The boats are the reason any of this is possible at all. Weeks earlier, every craft for miles up and down the river had been collected and brought to the Pennsylvania side, partly to use and mostly to deny, and among them are the Durham boats, great black shallow draft freighters, 40 to 60 feet long, 8 feet in the beam, double-ended, built to haul pig iron and grain down from the furnace country to Philadelphia. They draw almost nothing when they are light, and they will carry an appalling load, and they are worked with setting poles and long sweeps by men standing on walking boards down each side. They have no seats. Whatever you have seen in a painting, nobody in those boats is standing in the bow in a good coat looking nobly at the far shore. Everyone is packed in, standing because there is nowhere to sit, holding a musket muzzle down out of the wet, being told to keep still. And the men handling the boats are the reason the night does not simply end at the water. They are Colonel John Glover's regiment out of Marblehead in Massachusetts, the 14th Continental, and they are sailors and fishermen who have spent their working lives on the Grand Banks in weather that makes a river look like a joke. They had already rowed an entire army off Long Island in fog 4 months earlier without losing anybody, which remains one of the quietly astonishing feats of the war. Tonight they will do it again, in worse conditions, in the dark with ice. The crossing is meant to start at nightfall and be finished by midnight. It starts around 5 and it is behind almost immediately, and it stays behind all night. The river is running ice, not a sheet you could walk on, but flows, slabs of it turning down with the current and slamming into the boat's sides with a sound like somebody dropping a door. Horses have to be persuaded onto flat ferry scows in the dark, and horses have views about this. The guns go over with Knox bellowing at people, his voice being the one instrument nobody ever needed to amplify. At about 8 in the evening the weather breaks, and it breaks properly. A nor'easter comes up the valley, and over the next hours it throws rain, then hail, then sleet, then snow, sometimes several of them together, straight into the faces of men standing in open boats. Hail on a hat brim, sleet down a collar, wet wool that will not dry for a day and a half. 2 other columns are supposed to be crossing downstream at the same time, Cadwallader below Bordentown and Ewing opposite Trenton, and both of them fail, defeated by ice at their landings, which means that by 3 in the morning, when the last of the guns is finally over, the force on the Jersey bank is entirely alone with no support coming and no easy way back. Then they walk. It is 9 miles down to Trenton, in the dark, in the storm, on a road that is mud where it is not ice and ice where it is not mud. The column splits at a crossroads, one wing taking the upper road and one the road along the river, both aiming to arrive at the same hour. Men fall out. Sentries are posted at farm lanes so that nobody can slip away and warn anyone. Officers pass word back down the line to close up, close up. Somewhere on that march, 2 men sit down in the wet snow to rest, as people do and do not get up again. And they are found, and the fact is recorded, and their names are not. And of everything in this whole long winter, that is perhaps the detail worth carrying with you. That the cold on that road was sufficient, on its own, without an enemy anywhere in sight, to kill. The morning of the 26th comes up grey and filthy, snow driving from the northeast, and the column reaches the edge of Trenton at about 8, roughly 3 hours later than intended, and in broad daylight, which was supposed to be a catastrophe and was not. What follows is short. The town is held by 3 Hessian regiments who have had a hard month of alarms and a long night, and the attack comes down both main streets at once with the guns firing straight along them, and it is over in something under an hour. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, is hit early and carried into a church and then to a house, and dies of it the next day, and he is spoken of afterwards with more sympathy than you might expect by the men who beat him. Roughly 900 Hessians are taken prisoner. American losses in the fighting are astonishingly light. A couple of officers wounded, one of them a young Virginian lieutenant named Monroe, who has a rather long career ahead of him. Historians still argue about the story that Rall was handed a note that night warning him of exactly this and put it unread in his pocket, where it was found afterwards. It is too neat, and it has been repeated for 2 centuries, and it may be true, and it may be the sort of thing armies invent to explain a surprise. What is not arguable is the weather and the ice and the 9 miles and the hour, none of which you know yet. In your farmhouse the storm is still going, the shutters are complaining, the fire is banked, and the first you will learn of any of it is a sound on the road the following day. Wheels and many feet and voices speaking German, coming your way through the snow. By the time the news reaches your kitchen, it has been improved 3 or 4 times in the telling, which is what news does on a winter road, and so the first version has the whole garrison taken asleep in their beds, and the second has them taken in their nightshirts, and the third, from a man who heard it from a man who was very nearly there, has them taken while still holding their Christmas punch. The truth is quieter and rather better. Somewhere near 900 prisoners, a colonel carried off the field mortally wounded, and an army that has just discovered, at the last possible moment and with frozen feet, that it is still an army. But truth travels slower than punch, and by the time it reaches you, you have already gone out to the lane twice to look because sound carries strangely on cold air, and you keep thinking you hear drums. Then, a few days after, there is the road itself. The prisoners come back across the Delaware and up through the Pennsylvania farm country, and it is a long, slow, shuffling column, and half the county turns out to stand at the fence rails and watch it pass. They are marched down to Philadelphia and paraded through the streets at the very end of December, which is a piece of theatre as deliberate as anything ever staged, and then most of them are walked on westward to Lancaster and the towns beyond it. Word runs ahead of them the way word does, and so by the time the column reaches any particular stretch of road, the people at the fence have already been standing there in the cold for an hour, blowing on their hands, waiting to see monsters, because that is what they have been told to expect. All autumn the papers and the pulpits and the men at the mill have been describing the Hessians as something not quite human, hired butchers, sold by their own prince like cattle at a fair, men who spit children on bayonets and burn houses for the warmth of it. Some of that was earned. The plundering across New Jersey was real, and there are farms not 10 miles from yours that can show you the empty pegs where the harness used to hang. But a great deal of it was simply the ordinary manufacture of an enemy, and it has been very thoroughly manufactured, and now here the enemy comes, walking, and what walks past the fence rail is a column of cold, hungry, homesick young men. Some of them are barely older than your brother. Their coats are good blue wool, but the wool has been rained on and slept in for a month. Their hair is queued and greased and stiffened at the back, into a hard little tail, and the grenadiers among them still have the tall brass-fronted caps that made them look 8 feet high in the newspapers, and now mostly make them look tired. And then a Pennsylvania farm wife at the roadside says something to one of them in German, because half of that county speaks German at home, and he answers her in German. And she goes back into the house and comes out with bread, and the whole architecture of monstrousness falls over quietly in the road, with nobody making a speech about it. Congress, it must be said, had thought about this in advance and was not being sentimental. Back in the summer it had resolved to offer land to any Hessian who chose to lay down his arms and stay, 50 acres, which for a young man from a small German principality is an unimaginable quantity of dirt to own, and the prisoners are sent inland deliberately, among German-speaking farmers, so that they can see with their own eyes what a man with 50 acres and no landgrave looks like. It is one of the coldest-blooded and most effective things anybody does that winter, and it is done entirely with bread, farms, and conversation. A number of them never go home. There are families in Pennsylvania today whose great-great-grandfather arrived in this country as somebody else's expensive mistake. The wounded and the sick do not walk to Lancaster. They go north, many of them to Bethlehem, where the Moravians have built a settlement of solid stone buildings, and where the great single brethren's house, put up for unmarried men who spent their days at trades and their evenings singing, is taken over as a hospital for the army. The Moravians are not soldiers and want no part of the war, and they receive it anyway in wagon loads all winter. They have a habit that you would find beautiful and a little unnerving. When one of their own dies, the death is announced from the tower by trombones, a specific chorale for a specific kind of person, so that the whole town knows before breakfast who has gone. That winter the trombones get a great deal of use, and not all of it for Moravians, which brings the war into your own kitchen, because the sick do not all reach Bethlehem. Some of them get as far as your lane and no farther, and a sergeant knocks and asks, and there is a short conversation at the door that your mother conducts with her arms folded, and then there is straw on the kitchen floor near the hearth, and a man on it under a coverlet you are rather fond of, and broth, and the smell of a stranger's fever in a room where you eat. You know the risk perfectly well. Camp fever runs through houses the way fire runs through a hayrick, and everybody in this county can name a family that took in one soldier and buried 3 of their own. You do it anyway, partly because he is somebody's son, and partly because there is no version of saying no that you could live in afterwards. So the war becomes a quiet economy passing through a kitchen. His shirt is boiled in the big kettle with lye soap and beaten and hung stiff by the fire, and then it is mended, and then 2 more shirts arrive from somewhere. And those are boiled and mended too, because the army has discovered that a soldier without a whole shirt is a soldier with a fever coming. Women are paid for this work by the shirt, in continental money, which is a phrase that will get funnier and less funny all winter. A quartermaster's man comes and takes 40 bushels of your oats and 11 of your father's fence rails, and leaves a signed certificate promising payment, and that certificate is worth precisely as much as the government that signed it, a fact your father will mention at intervals for the next 6 years. Historians still argue whether the parade of prisoners through Philadelphia did more for American morale than the battle that produced them. And, standing at the fence in the cold, watching tired boys walk by, you can see the argument from both sides at once. The cold comes on properly in the first days of January, and it comes the way real cold always comes, not as a storm but as a silence. The wind swings around to the northwest and then simply stops, and the sky goes that scoured, depthless blue that means the night is going to be serious. And by evening the snow in the yard squeaks underfoot instead of crunching. Squeaking snow is the old test, and it is a good one. Crunching means cold, squeaking means very cold, and squeaking in a high thin voice like a badly hung door means put the calves in the barn and do not argue about it. Down at Trenton the war is having its second act. Cornwallis, who had gone off to New York with his baggage packed and his passage home half arranged, has come back down through New Jersey in a very great hurry, and on the 2nd of January he pushes his column into Trenton against an American army drawn up on the far bank of the Assunpink Creek with the bridge in front of it. 3 times the British come at the stone bridge, and 3 times the guns on the bank take them apart, and then the winter dark closes it down, because the light is gone by 4:30 and nobody fights what they cannot see. It is said Cornwallis told his officers there was no hurry, that they had the old fox safe and would bag him in the morning. Historians still argue whether he ever said anything of the kind, or whether some later writer simply decided it was too good a line to leave unspoken, which is the fate of most memorable sentences. What happens instead is the most quietly brilliant thing that army does all winter, and it happens because of the mud. The road behind the American position had thawed in the afternoon sun into the kind of churned brown soup that swallows a gun carriage to the axle, and in the ordinary way of things that road is impassable, and the army is trapped against a river. But the temperature drops through the evening, and keeps dropping, and by midnight the ruts have set like iron. So the fires are built up along the creek and left burning bright, and a few hundred men are left behind to make noise with picks and shovels as though they are digging in for a siege, and the rest of the army wraps its wheels in rags and walks away sideways into the dark along a back road, and the guns roll over ground that 6 hours earlier would have eaten them. By sunrise on the 3rd of January they are at Princeton, coming in behind the British, and there is a short, savage, confused fight in an orchard and across frozen fields, and by mid-morning it is over and the army's gone north again before Cornwallis can turn around. There is a story about Princeton that everyone tells, which is that an American cannonball came through the wall of Nassau Hall, where the college kept its prayer room, and neatly decapitated a portrait of King George II hanging on the wall. Whether it happened exactly like that is anybody's guess, but the college certainly ended the day with a headless king and, some years later, with a fine new portrait of General Washington painted to fill the same frame, which is either divine providence or very good management by a college treasurer. None of which you see. What you see is the weather. The freeze that carried those guns sits down on your farm and stays. The well rope goes stiff and then furred with ice, and then has to be thawed at the fire before it will run over the pulley. And the bucket comes up with a lid of grey ice on it that you break with the back of a hatchet. Water left in a bucket by the bed overnight, and there is always water by the bed, because a house full of people and one fire is a thirsty place, has a skin on it thick enough to lift out whole in the morning and hold up to the window like a pane of glass, which the smaller children think is enormously funny for about 4 days. The milk in the pantry freezes and pushes its cream up out of the pan in a pale column. The bread freezes. Ink freezes in the standish, so nobody writes letters, which is one small reason why the coldest weeks of that winter left the fewest words behind. The house talks at night. Nails contract in the boards and snap like small shots, and out in the orchard the trees crack with a noise, like a gun going off 2 fields away, and you lie there in a bed with 3 other people and a heated brick wrapped in flannel at the bottom of it, and listen. Frost grows on the inside of the window in ferns and feathers, 1/4 of an inch thick by morning, and you can scrape a peephole with a fingernail and see nothing but a lane drifted shut and a fence line reduced to a soft white ridge, with the top rail showing like a row of teeth. There is a particular silence to very cold air. It carries sound farther and yet flattens it. So a dog barking a mile off arrives clean and small and separate, and between the barks there is a quiet so complete that you can hear the fire in the next room settling. Nobody in your house owns a thermometer. They exist. Fahrenheit gave the world his scale back in 1724, and a gentleman in Philadelphia could buy one, and one did. Thomas Jefferson walked into a shop on 2nd Street and bought a thermometer on the 4th of July 1776, which suggests the man had a robust sense of priorities on a busy day. But an instrument like that costs several pounds and belongs to the world of libraries and orreries, not to a farmhouse where the good candlesticks are pewter. So cold is measured in effects, and the effects are exact. Cold enough to freeze the cider in the cellar, cold enough that the pump wants boiling water before it will do anything at all, cold enough that breath freezes on the blanket edge in a grey rime by your chin, cold enough that your father says nothing about the weather, which is the most alarming reading on the whole instrument, because a man who is willing to complain about cold still believes it is negotiable. The army does not stay near the river. In the first week of January it turns north and inland, up through the hills, and settles at Morristown. And the choice is not sentimental in the least. Morristown sits behind the Watchung Mountains, which are not mountains in the way a Scotsman would use the word. They are long, steep, wooded ridges, and if you saw them in summer you would call them hills and think no more about it. In winter, with an army in them, they are a wall. There are only a few gaps where a road can get through, and every one of those gaps can be watched. And from the high ground you can look east over the plain toward New Brunswick and Amboy and see the smoke of the enemy's fires. It is a position from which a small army can look large, threaten everything, and be attacked by nothing without a great deal of notice. Washington takes for his headquarters Jacob Arnold's Tavern, a square, respectable building on the northwest side of the Morristown Green, with a long room where the county has been holding its dances and its lawsuits for years. Arnold himself commands the local troop of light horse, so the arrangement is less an imposition than a promotion. The general's clerks fill the parlours, the express riders come and go at all hours through the front door and the mud and the tap room, which has spent its whole existence hearing about hay prices and church politics, spends that winter hearing about the disposition of an army. And now consider what this does to Morristown, which before January is a village of perhaps 250 souls, 50-odd houses arranged around a green, a Presbyterian meeting house, a Baptist meeting house, a store, a tavern or two, and an iron forge or 3 in the hills behind. Into that, over the space of about a week, comes an army. The numbers rise and fall alarmingly all winter, because enlistments expire and militia come and go and sickness takes its share. But there are stretches when the soldiers in and around that little town outnumber the people who live there by several times over. The green becomes a parade ground. The meeting houses become barracks. Barns become barracks. Kitchens become barracks. There is a joke in the county that winter about a man who went out to milk and found 4 Connecticut men asleep in the hay and a 5th already milking. And the joke is funny largely because it is not much of an exaggeration. The arithmetic of this is brutal, and nobody writes it down properly, so you have to do it yourself while lying in bed listening to strangers cough in your barn. A household burns 30 or 40 cords of wood in a year, and that is a household of 6 or 8 people with 1 or 2 fires. Now multiply by an army, in January, in the hills, with men who have been sleeping in wet wool since November, and who will burn absolutely anything that will take a spark. Fence rails go first, because a fence rail is a split, seasoned, perfectly sized piece of dry oak, sitting conveniently at waist height, and any soldier who tells you otherwise is lying. Whole miles of fencing vanished that winter across New Jersey, and every rail of it belonged to somebody who had split it himself. Then flour, which the mills grind and the army buys and the price of which climbs steadily. Then straw, for bedding, for men and horses both, and there is only so much straw in a county in January and no more coming until August. Then hay, then oats, then the horses themselves, then wagons, then the men to drive the wagons, all of it taken up by quartermasters who pay in certificates and continental dollars and apologies. Every single thing in Morristown costs more in February than it did in December, and the person who feels that first is not the general and not the colonel, but the woman who has to go to the store for a pound of tea and finds it has doubled, and then finds there is none. Nobody puts this in a letter to Congress. The letters to Congress are about muskets and blankets and the shocking condition of the commissary. What does not go in the letters is the low, steady, entirely reasonable resentment of a farming town that has been generously permitted to feed a war. People are patriots and they are also people, and the 2 facts sit side by side at the same table. Your household ends, up with 3 men in the barn and 1 in the kitchen, and you feed them, and they are polite and they chop wood for you and they eat like a threshing crew. And by the middle of February, your mother has developed a way of looking at the meal barrel and then at the door that requires no words at all. Historians still argue about how far the Army's relations with New Jersey civilians that winter were built on genuine goodwill, and how far on simple, weary calculation, better these men in the barn than the other men who came in November and took the harness. There is a further complication, which is that the war does not politely pause for the season. From January into March, the countryside is alive with what gets called the Forage War. British and Hessian parties coming out of New Brunswick and Amboy to gather hay and grain and cattle, and militia and Continentals coming down out of the hills to make that as expensive as possible. It is a war of ambushes at bridges and shots from woodlots and stolen cows recovered at dusk, and it is fought almost entirely over the contents of barns, which means, if you are keeping score honestly, that the great strategic resource of New Jersey in the winter of 1777 is hay. Empires have been contested over spice and gold and rivers. Here 2 of the finest armies in the world spend 3 months fighting about what to feed a horse. And Washington, who has an army that looks respectable on paper and alarming in person, spends the winter making it look bigger than it is. Patrols where patrols will be seen, drums where drums will be heard, returns and letters written in the comfortable expectation that some of them will be intercepted and believed. One of the great bluffs of the age is being run out of a tavern on a village green, 12 miles from where you are chopping ice out of a water trough. There is a word nobody in your house says lightly, and it has 3 syllables, and everybody would rather talk about the weather. Smallpox goes through a settlement like weather itself, and everyone over 30 can point out the neighbours it marked. The pitted cheeks, the pulled eyelid, the man at the mill who lost an eye to it as a boy and does not care to discuss the subject. It kills something like 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 of the people it takes, more among children, and it does not kill quietly or quickly. In a war, with men from a dozen colonies packed into barns and churches and sharing blankets, it is not a risk. It is a certainty with a date on it that nobody has been told. Against it there is one thing, and it is a strange thing, and it goes by the name of inoculation, or variolation. The method is this. A small cut is made in the arm, hardly more than a scratch, sometimes with a thread drawn through it. Into that cut is put a little matter taken from somebody suffering a mild case. Then the person is shut away for 2 or 3 weeks. In due course comes the fever, and the headache, and the aching back, and then a scattering of pox, usually far fewer than in the natural disease, often on the arm and face and gone in a fortnight, and then it is over, and the person is safe from smallpox for the rest of their life. It works because the disease taken deliberately, in a small dose through the skin, is a milder thing than the disease taken by breathing it in a crowded room. Nobody at the time can explain why. They only know, from many thousands of arms, that it is true. The idea did not come from a European medical college. It came to Boston in 1721 by way of an enslaved African man named Onesimus, who told Cotton Mather that in his country they took the disease on purpose by this method, and that people who did so did not die of it. Mather badgered the town's physicians, all of whom told him he was mad except Zabdiel Boylston, who tried it, and was very nearly mobbed for his trouble, and whose results were so lopsidedly good that the argument was effectively finished. Someone threw a lighted grenade through Mather's window during that quarrel, which is a strong review of a medical opinion. By 1796, inoculation is common enough among people who can afford it and hold their nerve. In July of that year, while her husband was in Philadelphia doing something about a declaration, Abigail Adams took herself and her 4 children into Boston to be inoculated and wrote him letters about it, and they are among the most human documents of the whole revolution. The children did not all take it easily. Young Charles had a bad time of it, badly enough to frighten her thoroughly, and she nursed him through it, and reported the whole business to a husband 200 miles away, who could do precisely nothing except read. She did it because she had made the calculation that every parent of that generation made, which is that the disease is coming regardless, and the only real choice is whether it comes at a moment you have chosen, which is exactly the calculation Washington makes at Morristown in February 1777 on behalf of an entire army. He knows the disease from the inside. He caught it at 19 on a trip to Barbados in 1751, and it left its marks on his nose and cheeks for life, and he has watched it wreck the army in Canada. So he orders the whole force inoculated, and every new recruit coming in, and he writes to his officers that smallpox is more destructive to an army in the natural way than the enemy's sword. He also insists on 2 other things, speed and silence, because for 2 or 3 weeks after inoculation, a regiment is not a regiment. It is several hundred feverish men who could not stand a march, let alone a fight, and if the British in New Brunswick learn that the army in the hills is lying down in rows with a fever, the war could be finished in a fortnight by a brisk officer with a decent map. So it is done in waves, and quietly. Churches and private houses and barns from Morristown down through the county are turned into inoculation hospitals. The men are shut up in them, and the ordinary business of the army, the patrols, the drums, the loud confident letters, goes on around them as though nothing whatever is happening. Fewer than 1 in 100 of the inoculated men die, against something far worse if the disease had found them the natural way, and by spring Washington commands the first large army in the world to be systematically protected against smallpox. He does the same thing again at Valley Forge in the winter of 1778, having learned that a decision this good is worth repeating. Historians still argue whether that order was the single most consequential thing he did in 8 years of command, and the case is a great deal stronger than it sounds, because an army that's alive in April can lose a battle, and an army that is dead of the pox in March cannot do anything at all. And then there is your table, where the same argument happens on a smaller scale and with more shouting. Because the inoculators are working through the county now, and a man can be had for a few shillings, and the question is whether the family does it. Your father is for it, cautiously, in the way of a man who has thought about it for a year and would like it recorded that he thought about it. Your grandmother is dead against, on the grounds that it's asking for trouble to invite an illness into a house that has not yet got one, which is not a foolish position. It is simply the older arithmetic. Your mother sits at the head of the table with her hands flat on the board and works out loud, how a household feeds itself when 4 of its members are shut in the back room with a fever for 3 weeks in February, who milks, who carries, who is left to nurse the rest, and what happens if the pox comes anyway in March with nobody protected. It is the coldest, clearest piece of reasoning you have ever heard anyone do, and it takes about 11 minutes, and at the end of it there is a decision, and everybody goes to bed and nobody sleeps. Late January into February is the part of the winter nobody puts in a song. The drama is over. The crossing has been crossed, the guns are in the hills, and what is left is 6 weeks of a family eating its way slowly down through the contents of a cellar it filled in October with such enormous confidence. Nobody is starving, that is worth saying plainly. But the cellar door has been opened rather more times than the arithmetic allowed for, And every time it opens, there is a small internal accounting that nobody says out loud, and the level in the pork barrel is now visibly, undeniably, halfway down. The food itself becomes a kind of calendar with only one day on it. Morning is hasty pudding, which is cornmeal rained slowly into boiling salted water and stirred until your arm complains, and it is quick only by comparison with everything else in an 18th century kitchen. You eat it in a bowl with milk poured round it, or with molasses if there is molasses, and whatever is left is poured into a pan to set overnight and cut into slabs and fried in pork fat the next morning, at which point it becomes, technically, a different meal. Some mornings it is samp instead. Corn pounded coarse in a mortar and boiled long and slow into something between porridge and gravel, or mush and milk, which is hasty pudding with the ambition removed. At the middle of the day there is rye and Indian bread, which everyone in the county just calls rye and Injun, a dense dark loaf of rye flour and cornmeal baked in the beehive oven on baking day and expected to last the week. It does last the week. That is rather its whole personality. With it there is salt pork, boiled a long time with turnips and whatever else the cellar will still surrender, and the boiling is not optional, because a piece of pork out of the brine barrel in February is salty enough to make a cow blink. There is peas porridge, made from dried field peas, sitting in its pot at the edge of the hearth, warmed up and eaten down and topped up again for days on end, which is exactly what the nursery rhyme is about and always was. Peas porridge in the pot 9 days old is not a joke. It is a household inventory, and there are dried apples stewed soft with a little of the year's sugar or a spoonful of molasses until they go dark and sweet and slightly leathery at the edges, and they are the best thing on the table by a distance, and there are not enough of them, and everyone knows exactly how many are left because they hang in strings from the kitchen beams, where the whole family can count them without appearing to look. Here is the thing that does not get written down properly, because it is very hard to make sound like a hardship. The monotony is itself the hardship, not hunger, sameness. The same brown, salt-soft boiled food 3 times a day for 6 weeks, in a room lit by 1 fire and 2 candles, with nothing green in the world outside and nothing green in the world inside either. It grinds people down in a way that a single missed meal never does. Tempers go short in February for reasons the family will explain to itself as being about firewood, or the dog, or something your cousin said at Christmas, and are in fact about the 4th consecutive week of boiled pork and peas. There is a reason the first mess of dandelion greens in April gets treated in some houses like a religious festival. Meanwhile, there is a woman doing arithmetic every single day. Rationing in a farmhouse is not proclamations and weighed portions. It is one person, usually your mother, holding the whole ledger in her head. How many hams, how much meal, how deep the brine, how much butter is in the crock and how much of it must be traded rather than eaten, how many weeks until the hens start laying properly again, how many until the cow freshens, how many until anything at all grows. She serves the meals accordingly, and there is a great deal of quiet management in the way the platter goes round, and the man doing the heaviest work outdoors gets the most, and the children get the milk, and nobody discusses the system because discussing it would make it a system. Some houses in the neighbourhood do not have her arithmetic, or had a bad harvest, or lost their pig to a foraging party in December, and this is where the winter shows what a community actually is. Nobody in this county walks up a lane and says they are hungry. What happens instead is that a neighbour arrives about some other business entirely, a borrowed auger, a question about a stray heifer, and somewhere near the end of the conversation there is a mention of the meal running short sooner than expected, and a peck is lent, and it is a loan, and it is understood by both parties that it will be repaid at harvest, and also that nobody will ever mention it again if it is not. The word charity is not used. The word borrow does an enormous amount of work in New Jersey that winter. Beyond that there are the overseers of the poor, and the church, and for a widow with small children and no wood, cut there is a rougher, more public kind of help that costs the receiver something in pride. And under all of it, the money is quietly rotting. Congress has been printing continental dollars since 1775, and will print something like 241 million of them, and every month the paper in the tin box on the shelf buys a little less than it did. The store in the village still takes it, with a face. Nobody in the country trusts it, so almost nothing in your life is actually bought. It is bartered, butter and flax and ashes and a day, of your father's labour and the loan of the ox team. All of it written down in the merchant's ledger in his careful hand. Credits on one side and debits on the other, settled up once a year and mostly balanced with goods rather than coin. Historians still argue about how much the collapse of the currency actually hurt rural families as against town ones, and the honest answer from your kitchen is that a household which grows its own food and settles with a neighbour by ledger notices the war in its salt and its salt only. The trouble is what 6 weeks of that diet does to a body in a cold house. No greens, no fresh fruit, not much sun, everybody breathing the same. Smoky air in the same small warm room, and by the end of February the coughs have started and the children are pale and somebody's gums are sore and nobody's quite well. Which is when the house stops thinking about the cellar and starts thinking about the other shelf entirely, the one with the bottles on it. The cold finds your hands first, and it does not bother to announce itself. You come in from the woodyard with your fingers gone stupid and waxy at the tips, and you do the sensible thing, which is also precisely the wrong thing, and hold them out to the fire. And an hour later the skin along your knuckles is swollen up red and glossy and hot, and it itches with an itch that has no bottom to it. That is chilblain, and it is the small, undignified injury of an 18th century winter. It will not kill you. It will not even impress anyone. It simply burns and prickles in your toes and your fingers and the rims of your ears every evening the moment you sit down near the hearth, and it goes on doing that until roughly April, by which point you would cheerfully trade a good milk cow for one night of not thinking about your own feet. Frostbite is the quieter cousin, and it is quiet because it takes the feeling away before it takes anything else. You are out fetching, the cattle in a wind that has come down off the ridge with nothing in its way, and at some point your cheek stops stinging. That is the part to be careful about. The skin goes pale and slightly hard, like candle wax pressed with a thumb, and it does not hurt at all until it is brought back to warmth, and then it hurts extravagantly, in pins and hot needles and a deep ache in the bone. Your mother's rule is that you thaw slowly, in cool water or against a warm belly or under an arm, never at the fire and never rubbed with snow, though half the neighbourhood swears by rubbing with snow. Your mother thinks half the neighbourhood is a fool. Your mother is largely correct. The rest of the winter's illnesses arrive with names that sound worse than they are, and occasionally are worse than they sound. There is the winter fever, which is what people call almost anything that puts you in bed shaking with a hot face and an aching back. There is pleurisy, a stitch in the side that makes each breath feel too expensive to take, so you breathe shallowly and cough like a small dog. There is quinsy, the throat swollen so tight that swallowing becomes a decision rather than a reflex, and the ague, which is malaria, and which is far more at home in the marshy bottoms of New Jersey than anyone in New Jersey would like. The ague runs on a timetable, the shaking, then the burning, then the sweat, then a day or two of feeling almost human before the whole performance begins again. People with the ague learn their own schedule and plan their chores around it, which is either admirable or depressing depending on the hour you ask. Against all of this stands the garret. Go up the ladder with a candle and you walk into a smell you will remember your entire life. Dust and dry leaves and something faintly bitter and green underneath. Bunches hang head down from the rafters and from lines of twine strung across the beams, tied last August when the sun was foolishly generous. There is bone set, which is for fevers and which tastes so vilely bitter that generations of children have concluded the cure was invented as a punishment. There is pennyroyal, sharp and minty for a sweat. Sage, for the throat, brewed strong and taken with honey and a little vinegar. Horehound, fuzzy and grey, boiled down with sugar into a candy for coughs. Genuinely the only one anybody volunteers for. Elecampane, a great coarse root dug in autumn and sliced and dried for the chest. And catnip and chamomile and tansy and mullein, and a paper of dried elderflowers, and a stone jar of goose grease, because goose grease goes into nearly everything and improves nearly nothing. From these come the three great forms of home doctoring. Poultices, herbs or bread or ground flaxseed or mashed onion, warmed, wrapped in a scrap of linen, laid on the chest or throat, changed as it cools, until the patient smells like an unusually ambitious soup. Plasters, sticky and stiffened with pitch or resin and spread on cloth, meant to stay put and draw, and syrups, boiled thick with honey or molasses, kept in a corked bottle on the shelf and given by the spoon. Whatever they did or did not do medically, they did something real. They meant that somebody was sitting beside you, warming cloths, counting hours, paying attention. In a cold house in February, that is not nothing. Then there is the confident part. The age believes, sincerely and almost universally, in blistering and in bleeding, in raising a blister with a plaster to draw the sickness out to the surface, and in opening a vein to let out what the body is thought to have too much of. Grown people go into these procedures with the calm of someone getting a horse shod. Historians still argue whether the bleeding of the period killed more patients than it ever helped, or whether the modest amounts usually taken in a farmhouse mattered much either way. The arguments get heated, which is ironic given the subject. William Buchan's Domestic Medicine, first printed in Britain in 1769 and reprinted in Philadelphia in 1771, sat on shelves across the colonies telling ordinary families how to do these things themselves, and it sold so well that it became one of the most common books in America after the Bible. And under all of it, more trusted than any printed book, is the receipt book. It is a stitched or bound blank book kept in a woman's hand, and it does not distinguish between cookery and medicine, because nobody at the time does either. A receipt for gingerbread sits directly above a receipt for a salve. The handwriting changes as you turn the pages, your grandmother's, then your mother's, then, in a stiffer and more careful hand, an aunt's. There are marginal notes, which are the best part. This one is good, this one is not. Sarah says to use less. Somebody has written, beside a cure for warts involving a stolen dishcloth buried under the eaves at the full moon, the single word doubtful. The book will be handed down, and someone will add to it, and the doubtful will be handed down too. When somebody in the house falls ill, there is an order to who is called, and it is a very firm order. First your mother, who is the physician of this household in every practical sense, and who has treated more fevers than most licensed men have seen. Then, if it looks serious, the neighbour woman down the lane who's known to be good in a sick room. Every neighbourhood has one, and she comes with her own bag and her own opinions, and she never seems to need sleep. Then the midwife, who in these years attends not only births, but the general run of sickness, and who is very often the most experienced medical person for 6 miles in any direction. And only then, last, a doctor, if there is one within reach, and if the roads are open, and if you can pay him, which in the winter of 1777 means paying in a bushel of wheat, or a side of bacon, or a promise entered in his ledger to be settled sometime after harvest. He may come tomorrow, he may come the day after. By then, more often than not, the fever has already decided the matter one way or the other, and the house has gone quiet, and someone has put a fresh cloth on her forehead, and the kettle is on again. By 4:30 the light is gone, not dimming, gone, the way a door closes. You look up from the churn and the window has turned from grey to blue to a flat pewter nothing, and the room, which was merely dark, is now dark in a way that has weight to it. There are still 4 or 5 hours to be got through before anybody sleeps, and those hours have to be lit, and light is expensive. Everything in the evening arranges itself around that single fact, which is why, on a raw afternoon in autumn, the whole house smells of hot mutton fat. Candle dipping is a full day's work, and nobody looks forward to it. The tallow, rendered beef and mutton sweet, clarified and skimmed, goes into a big kettle set over a slow fire, kept just hot enough to stay liquid and no hotter. Wicks of loosely twisted cotton are tied along thin rods, 6 or 8 to a rod, hanging straight down and spaced so they cannot touch. Then you dip. Down into the fat, a slow count, up again, and hang the rod across 2 poles to cool. Then the next rod, and the next, and by the time you reach the end of the row, the first one has hardened and is ready to go again. Down, up, hang, down, up, hang. Each pass adds a skin of fat perhaps as thick as a sheet of paper. It takes 20 or 30 dips to make a candle worth burning, and the fat must never be too hot, or the last coat melts off the one before it, undoing an hour's patience in about 4 seconds. This is a very good way to learn the virtue of not being in a hurry, and a very good way to lose it. The result is a tallow candle, soft, slightly yellow, faintly greasy to the touch, and a little smelly when it burns, because it is, after all, a stick of animal fat with a string in it. The wick does not consume itself, so it grows a black mushroom-headed char that has to be snipped off with snuffers every few minutes, or the flame gutters down and starts to smoke, and the whole room smells like a kitchen accident. Somebody is always the snuffer. It is usually a child, and it is usually the same child, and that child holds strong private opinions about the arrangement. Beeswax burns cleaner, brighter and sweeter, and beeswax is for churches and for people with money, because bees are stubborn about scale. Bayberry wax, boiled off the little grey berries of the coastal shrub, gives a lovely green candle that smells wonderful when snuffed, and takes something like 15 pounds of berries to make 1 pound of wax, which explains why the Bayberry candles are kept for company. Below the candle in the hierarchy of light are the rushlight and the Betty lamp. A rushlight is a peeled rush stalk soaked in leftover grease and held at an angle in a pinch-jaw stand. It gives a small, wobbling, honest flame for maybe half an hour, and costs essentially nothing but the trouble of gathering rushes in the meadow. A Betty lamp is a shallow iron dish of grease with a wick lying in a spout, and it smokes and it drips and it smells like whatever animal donated to the cause, and it will keep going all night. Neither one is any good for fine sewing. Both are excellent for finding the stairs. But the truth of the evening is that most of the light comes from the fire, and this is why everyone sits in a ring. It is not sentiment. It is geometry. The heat and the light come from one place, and the useful zone in front of a hearth is perhaps 8 feet deep, and beyond that the room drops away into cold and shadow. So the settle is pulled up, and the stools and the low chairs, and everybody faces inward. And if you turn your back to the fire, your face freezes, and if you face it, your back does. So the whole family slowly rotates through the evening like meat on a spit. Nobody sits alone in a corner reading privately, because there is no light in the corner, and there is no privacy in the house. And so the hands go to work, because hands can work by firelight even when eyes cannot read by it. The great wheel turns and the wool draws out and the little flax wheel treadles away in the corner. Knitting needles click. Stockings, always stockings. Everyone in the family needs stockings and they wear out from the heel up. A man whittles, axe helves, tool handles, a butter paddle, a broken tooth for the hay rake, or a whistle for a child who will be sorry about that whistle within an hour, though not as sorry as everyone else. Harness is mended with wax thread and an awl. Somebody cracks hickory nuts and walnuts on a flat stone laid on the hearth, and the shells go into the fire, and the little grubby business of picking the meats out with a bent pin can occupy a 7-year-old for a remarkably long time. Somebody reads aloud, because a book read aloud lights the whole room at the price of 1 candle. The Bible, of course. Most evenings, chapter by chapter, all the way through and then round again. And the almanac, which in this house means Nathaniel Ames's Astronomical Diary and Almanac out of Dedham, the sort of book that sold in tens of thousands of copies a year up and down the coast and told you the phases of the moon, the tides, the court days, the roads and distances when to expect frost, and squeezed into the margins between the weather guesses, proverbs, verses, jokes, and small essays. People read almanacs the way people now read anything with pictures, in no particular order, out loud and mostly for the bits at the bottom of the page. Historians still argue about how much ordinary people actually believed the almanac's weather predictions, given that everyone quoted them constantly, and everyone also complained bitterly when they were wrong, which is a pattern that has proved durable, then riddles, which are a whole genre. The answer is usually an egg, or a candle, or a coffin, and colonial riddles have a fondness for the last one that modern parents might find bracing. Games, Hunt the Slipper, Blind Man's Buff, Cat's Cradle with a loop of thread, and Questions and Commands, which is essentially a forfeit game, and which usually ends with somebody being made to kiss somebody or crawl under the table. The children are put to bed with a warming pan run between the sheets, or a hot brick wrapped in flannel at their feet, and the fire is banked, the coals raked together and covered with ash so that they smoulder till morning, because starting a fire from nothing is a genuinely miserable business. And then the strangest part of the night, which is not strange at all if you live in it. You sleep for 3 or 4 hours and you wake. Not badly, simply awake. Sometime near midnight in the dark. This is the end of what people call your first sleep. There is an hour or so of quiet before the second sleep, and it belongs to nobody but you. People pray in it, and think in it, and talk softly with whoever is beside them, and turn over the day and go out to check on a sick animal. And some of the most private conversations of the 18th century happen in that hour in a black bedroom with a hot brick going cold at the foot of the bed. Then the drowsiness comes back and you fall into the second sleep and the fire ticks and settles under its ash and the house waits for morning. Somewhere in January the war stops being an event and becomes a season. The great set pieces are over for now, the crossing, Trenton, Princeton, and what settles across the middle of New Jersey instead is something smaller, meaner, and far more personal, and it has to do with hay. Consider the arithmetic from the British side, because it is not complicated and it is entirely ruthless. An army in winter quarters at New Brunswick and Perth Amboy, and along that corridor is an army full of horses, draft horses for the wagons, artillery teams, cavalry mounts, officers' mounts. A working horse eats something like 20 pounds of hay a day, plus grain, and there are thousands of them. None of that fodder is coming across the Atlantic in a ship, which means it has to come out of New Jersey's barns and stacks and mows. So through January, February and March, foraging parties go out from the garrisons, a few hundred men, sometimes 1,000 or more, with wagons and a covering force, to sweep the countryside for hay, grain, cattle, sheep and horses, and every time they go out the militia is waiting, not in lines, not in formation, not in anything a European officer would recognise as a battle, behind fences, in woodlots, at the bend where the road drops into a hollow, firing, moving, firing again, hanging on the flanks of a column all day like wasps on a walking horse. This is what gets called the Forage War, and its scale is genuinely startling once you add it up. Dozens upon dozens of skirmishes between January and March 1711, and British and Hessian casualties over those weeks that, taken together, comfortably exceed what they lost at Trenton and Princeton combined. On the 20th of January at Van Ness Mill on the Millstone River, General Philemon Dickinson takes 400 or so New Jersey militia across a river running with ice and drives off a substantially larger British foraging party, capturing wagons, 40-odd horses and over 100 head of cattle. Washington writes about it admiringly. Dickinson's men, he notes, behaved with spirit. Dickinson's men, one suspects, were also quite pleased about the cattle, all of which is thrilling if you are reading it later in a book by a lamp. It is considerably less thrilling if you are the barn, because here is your position, on a farm in Hunterdon County in the first months of 1777. You are sitting on top of the exact commodity that both armies need, and neither of them is going to leave it alone. The British want your hay because their horses will die without it. The Continentals and the militia want your hay for precisely the same reason, and they want it denied to the British as well. And a standing instruction of the winter is that forage that cannot be carried off should not be left where the enemy can get it. Your stacks are therefore either a supply, a target, or a bonfire, depending on who reaches the lane first and what kind of morning they are having. Both sides will offer you a receipt. British receipts are payable if you are a friend of the king and can prove it. Continental receipts are payable in continental currency, which everyone in the room understands is losing value roughly as fast as the ink dries. Historians still argue about how much of the plundering across New Jersey that winter was official policy, how much was hungry men in the dark, and how much was old neighbourhood grudges wearing a uniform for the afternoon. The depositions taken afterwards suggest, uncomfortably, that all three were doing a brisk trade, and so the war arrives at the level of the fence line and the surname. In November, the Howe brothers issued a proclamation offering pardon and protection to anyone who would come in within 60 days and swear allegiance to the crown, and through the dark weeks of the retreat, thousands of New Jersey people did exactly that. Because the Continental Army was visibly falling apart and the King's Army was visibly not, and a man with a wife and 4 children and a barn full of grain makes his calculations accordingly. They were given signed protection papers. Some of them framed those papers, metaphorically speaking, and slept better. Then came Trenton and Princeton, and on the 25th of January 1777, Washington issued a proclamation of his own. Anyone holding a British protection must surrender it, take an oath of allegiance to the United States, or withdraw within the enemy lines and be treated as an adherent of the king. 30 days. Choose. Some of Congress grumbled that a general had no business demanding oaths of civilians, which is a fair constitutional point that lands rather differently when there is a foraging party on your road. So people choose, and the county rearranges itself. Committees of safety, and, from spring, a state council of safety sit in session and take depositions, issue warrants, examine the suspected, administer oaths, and order the estates of the disaffected seized and sold. Neighbours inform on neighbours. Some of it is sincere, some of it is a boundary dispute from 1768 finding its moment at last. A man who sold his hay to the wrong quartermaster in December finds himself explaining that transaction in February to a committee containing the fellow he outbid at a vendue 3 years ago. Property is confiscated. Families leave in the night with what fits in a wagon. Some go to New York and eventually to Nova Scotia and never come back. And the quiet, awful middle of it is where most people actually live. The great majority of families in this county are not ideologues. They are trying to keep the stock alive, the children fed and the roof on until spring, and their sincere political program is to be nobody's enemy. That program does not work. It cannot work, because in a countryside where both armies are foraging and both sides are taking oaths, refusing to declare is itself read as a declaration, by both. The man who gave the British a load of hay at bayonet point in December is a Tory in February. The man who gave the militia a horse is a rebel in March. Word gets around. Word always gets around. And in a farming neighbourhood, word travels faster than any express rider, because the mill and the meeting house and the smithy have been the local newspaper since before anybody's grandfather was born. Here is the small quirk that stays with you. Amid all of this, the ordinary business of the neighbourhood keeps going because it has to. Families on opposite sides of the question still swap a yoke of oxen at ploughing time, still send a girl over with a poultice when a child is sick, still show up at the burying ground. There are documented cases up and down the state of men who informed on each other in one season and helped each other's harvest in the next, which either says something rather hopeful about human beings or something rather bleak about the durability of a grudge, and possibly both. You bank the fire, and you look out at the black lane and you think about hay. Then, near the end of February, something changes in the air, and the first thing that notices is your nose. There is a wet, brown, faintly sweet smell coming off the south side of the hill where the snow has gone thin. Water is moving somewhere under the ice in the ditch. The eaves drip all afternoon and then stop at dusk with a small sharp click as everything sets again. That is the pattern the whole thing depends on. Days above freezing, nights below. Thaw, freeze, thaw, freeze. And when that pattern establishes itself, the sap begins to run in the sugar maples up in the woodlot, and the household drops nearly everything else. It matters more than you might think, because sugar in 1777 is a strategic question. Sugar and molasses come from the West Indies, and the West Indies are on the far side of a British blockade, and every barrel that gets through has paid for the risk. Molasses that a family might once have used freely in gingerbread and in beer, and in the morning porridge is now priced like a small luxury. Rum, which is molasses in a more entertaining form, is going the same way. So a stand of maples on your own land is, for a few weeks each spring, a small, private sugar colony that no navy can blockade, and everyone in the neighbourhood knows it. You go up with an axe, a gouge, a mallet, a bundle of spiles and a sledge. The spiles have been whittled during those long evenings by the fire from sumac or elder, both of which have a soft pith you can push out with a hot wire, leaving a natural tube. Some people simply bore a hole and drive in a flattened chip of shingle to lead the drip. Older still, and still done, is the plain slanting gash cut into the bark with an axe, with a chip set beneath it, hard on the tree, and the reason there are trees in these woods with scars up their trunks like a row of closed eyes. You choose the biggest maples, the ones with a wide crown that has spent all summer making sugar, and you tap on the south side where the sun hits first. Then you set a trough beneath, basswood, hollowed out, or a small wooden bucket, and you wait, and within a few hours you hear it. A soft, irregular, hollow tick, 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 all through the grey woods, which is the sound of the year turning over. The sap itself is a disappointment on first acquaintance. It is clear as spring water and only faintly sweet, and a child who has been promised sugar and given a dipper of sap tends to look up with an expression of profound betrayal. It is roughly 2 parts sugar in 100, and that is the whole cruel arithmetic of the business. About 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, and more still to drive it down to hard sugar. Everything that follows is simply the removal of water, 1 kettle at a time, which means the sugar camp, a rough shelter of poles and bark up in the woodlot, a long fire trench, and the kettles hung from a green pole on iron hooks over the flames. Sap is carried in from the buckets on a neck yoke, 2 pails, 1 on each side, and a walk over rotten snow that gives way at the worst possible moment. The fire runs day and night for weeks, and everybody takes a turn. It goes on all night because you cannot let a kettle scorch, and because the sap keeps coming, and because there is a sort of contentment in it that nobody quite admits to. And the sugar camp at night is one of the loveliest scenes in the whole of the colonial year. Black woods, a bank of dirty snow, a low fire throwing orange up the trunks, and steam. Great slow rolling clouds of it going up through the bare branches and catching the light, and the smell, which is like caramel and wood smoke and wet bark all at once, and which gets into your coat and stays there until June. Someone is always asleep on a heap of blankets under the bark lean-to. Someone is always stirring. Somebody has brought a jug. Children are permitted to stay up far past any reasonable hour, on the strict understanding that they are helping, which they are not. Near the end, you take a ladle of the thickening syrup and pour it on clean snow, where it seizes into a chewy amber ribbon, and this is the single best thing that will happen to anyone in this family between November and May. Then the sugaring off, the syrup boiled down further in a smaller kettle, watched with terrible seriousness, stirred as it grains, and poured into moulds or wooden boxes to set into cakes of maple sugar. Brown and slightly grainy and a little smoky, which is how sugar is supposed to taste as far as you're concerned. Those cakes go on the shelf and get shaved with a knife into tea and porridge for the rest of the year. Historians still argue whether the colonists learned the whole business from the Indians or worked out the boiling independently once they had iron kettles to boil in. But the earliest English descriptions of tapping sugar trees in North America, Robert Beverley's account in his History of Virginia, printed in 1705 among them, describe a practice already long established among native peoples, and the word for the season in more than one Algonquian language predates any Englishman's kettle. And then the thaw finishes the job it started and the roads dissolve. Mud season is the tax you pay for spring. The frost comes out of the ground from the top down while the deeper layer stays hard so the water has nowhere to go, and every lane in the county turns into a trench of grey porridge 2 feet deep. Wagons sink to the hubs, horses lose shoes in it. Nothing moves, not the post, not the peddler, not the visiting cousin, and blessedly not the armies, whose artillery is even less enthusiastic about mud than you are. For a few weeks New Jersey is defended by its own topsoil. There is a genuine argument to be made that mud did more for the Continental cause in March 1777 than several regiments did, and the mud never asked to be paid in Continental dollars. Down in the cellar, meanwhile, things have reached their low point. You go down with a candle and it is all a bit sorry. The apples are wrinkled like old faces, and there is a soft one in every layer of straw that has to be found by smell. The turnips have gone woody and are throwing out pale sprouts in the dark, blindly, looking for a spring they cannot see. The parsnips, oddly, are the best they will ever be, sweetened by the frost. There is one cabbage left, and nobody wants to be the person who eats it. The pork barrel is down to the pieces you were saving because they were not very good. It is thin, and it is monotonous, and it is enough. And up in the woodlot the kettles are steaming, which means the year has turned, and the cellar only has to hold out a little longer. March comes in wet and goes about its work without ceremony. The lambs arrive first, usually at the worst possible hour, in a corner of the barn by lantern light, and there is a bad half hour and then a wet, staggering, ridiculous creature is up on 4 legs that clearly belong to a much larger animal. Within 2 days they are jumping sideways off nothing at all, which is the first genuinely frivolous thing anyone in this county has done since November. You catch yourself watching them for longer than the chore requires. Nobody comments on it because everybody's doing it. Then the geese. You hear them before you see them, that far-off rusty gabbling, and you straighten up with a fork in your hand and find the ragged line of them high and northbound against a sky that is finally more white than grey. Then the red-winged blackbirds come back to the wet meadow and sit on last year's cattails, making that noise like a hinge. And the shad start up the Delaware, which means the whole river valley turns out with nets and seines, because a good haul of shad in a lean March is the difference between a hard spring and a very hard one. They are bony, and they are oily, and they are salted down by the barrelful, and after the winter's pork they taste like a rumour of summer. The first green is not, disappointingly, anything you planted. It is the weeds, arriving with the total confidence of the uninvited. But out at the edge of the garden, where the snow melted first, there is a fringe of chives and a stand of sorrel, and the red nubs of the rhubarb pushing up like something out of a story. And there are dandelions and dock and lamb's quarters coming in the pasture. After 4 months of salt meat, turnip and rye bread, the household falls upon these greens with an enthusiasm that has nothing to do with taste. Bodies know what they have been missing even when the people inside them cannot name it, and everybody's gums stop being sore, and everybody's mood improves, and nobody in 1777 quite knows why. Then the plough. You wait for the ground to be fit, which means you go out and take a handful of soil and squeeze it, and if it holds together in a wet ball you wait another week, and if it crumbles you go and get the oxen. The plough is wood with an iron-shod share and a mouldboard your grandfather shaped by eye, and it does not so much cut the furrow as argue with it. You walk behind it all day with the lines over your shoulder, and the gulls come inland to follow you, and by evening your arms are shaking and there is a long dark stripe across the field that was not there in the morning. Oats go in first, and flax, and then the peas, and later the corn when the soil warms, planted by the old rule 4 seeds to the hill, 1 for the blackbird, 1 for the crow, 1 for the cutworm and 1 to grow, which is a charming little rhyme, and also a sober statement of expected losses. And you count. Not out loud, and not at length, but you count. Which of the neighbours' names is not read out now? The old man at the end of the lane who took the winter fever in February and simply did not come back from it. The baby 2 farms over who was there in November. The 2 boys from this township who went with the militia in December, and one of whom is at home now with his fingers stiff and strange from the cold, and one of whom is not. You count the stock too because you must. The ewe that did not get through lambing, the cow gone dry, the horse the foragers took in January, and the receipt in the drawer that will never be worth the paper. There are gaps at the meeting house and gaps in the fold and gaps at the table, and the way this family handles them is the way it handles everything. Quietly, at chores, saying the name once and then going on with the work. Because the work is the only thing that has ever been offered as consolation, and on most days, it is enough. Out in the wider world, nothing is settled. Congress, which fled to Baltimore in December, comes back to Philadelphia and sits again in early March 1777, having discovered that Baltimore in winter was, in the words of one exhausted delegate, an infinitely dirty place. Washington sits at Morristown through the spring with an army that shrinks alarmingly every time enlistments expire, and at moments that winter he has fewer than 3,000 fit men within reach, and spends a great deal of energy making sure nobody finds that out. False returns, widespread quarters, confident letters, and a steady stream of militia marching in one road and out the other to look like more. Historians still argue about how close the whole thing came to collapsing in those weeks, and whether the campaign was saved by generalship, by militia in the hedgerows, by smallpox inoculation, or simply by the fact that Sir William Howe seems to have been in no particular hurry. Probably all four. Probably in an order nobody will ever agree on. But that is not the thing this family won. This family did not win a battle. It cannot end a war, or set a price, or open a port, or make continental money mean anything. What it could do, it did. It got the wood cut and stacked before the frost. It killed the hog on the right cold morning and got the salt at a price that still stings. It kept the cellar cold and not freezing. It spun and wove and mended so that everyone had something on their feet. It nursed the fevers with what grew in the garret. It hid what could be hidden, gave up what had to be given up, and stood in the doorway when men with muskets came up the lane, and did not lose the house. The war is not over. The winter is over. That is the only thing this family was ever actually able to win, and they won it. So put the ploughshare under the eaves, the seed is in, and now let it go. The fire is low, the house is warm enough. Outside, the fields lie dark and quiet, and the frost is going out of the ground, and there is nothing more to be done tonight. The lambs are folded, the geese have passed over, the last of the wood is stacked, and it does not have to last much longer now. You can hear the small sounds, a settling coal, the wind, gone soft, water moving somewhere under the grass. The garret is nearly empty. The buckets are washed and turned over. The kettle is cool, the door is barred, the animals are fed, the water is drawn, there is nothing to count, nothing to carry, nothing to hide, nothing is asked of you now. Not tonight. The dark outside is only dark. It is not cold anymore. It is just the night, and it is soft, and it is going by without you. The long dark is behind you. It was cold, and it was long, and you are still here. Let your shoulders come down. Let your hands open. The room is dim and kind. The bed is warm. Somewhere out there the plough is waiting, and the seed is in the ground, and the ground is doing the rest without you. It does not need you tonight. The candle is nearly out. Let it be. 250 years from now the field is still a field. Somebody is still watching the geese go over. Somebody is still glad when the light comes back. You did the small things. The small things were the whole of it. Sleep now. Breathe out. It is spring. Good night.